Hello, everyone, and today we're doing another live stream. This time I am going to be reviewing the recent discussion, not a debate, a discussion between Scott Clifton and William Lane Craig concerning the Kalam cosmological argument. So I've had a few requests to cover this one, and I haven't actually watched it yet. I've only seen a few clips and heard a couple of things. I thought it might be more engaging to just do a sort of a live react. Um, and I've lost the train of thought of that sentence. Oh yeah, so I was interested to see that Craig agreed to this discussion. We know that Craig doesn't do debates with people who don't have PhDs, and he seems to have perhaps relaxed that rule is not quite accurate. He seems to have interpreted that rule in different ways more recently, so that he does discussions with people who don't have a PhD, which I mean is different to a formal debate, to be fair, although in practice can amount to sort of a similar dynamic. So that appears to be what one of these is. So I didn't really know who Scott Clifton was. Well, I still don't really know who he is, but he's like an actor who's engaged in some degree of atheist activism, and I listened to one of his talks that he gave on the Kalam several years ago. I recently listened to a talk that he gave several years ago about the Kalam, to clarify, and it was decent. I'm not going to review that here, but that's the extent of what I know about him. So it looks like he has some interesting points to make. I'm not quite sure what direction he's going to go with the we're discussing with Craig. Yeah, and I'm not quite sure why this particular pairing was suggested, other than maybe, I guess, Scott Clifton has a reasonably high profile, so that might have been relevant. I mean, I guess Craig can talk to whoever he likes, so that's fine. But it's just sort of interesting. So why don't we just think if there's anything else I wanted to say in by virtue of introduction? I don't think so. So let's make a start here, and it's only an hour long, so yeah, let's just jump straight in.
Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Christianity. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi, and today I'm hosting a dialogue between none other than Dr. William Lane Craig, and I've got actually a friend of mine, Scott Clifton, here with us, and we're talking about today the Kalam cosmological argument. And so I actually don't want to waste any time on.
So before we jump into it, let's do the bookshelf rankings as always. So I think that Scott here is taking a very interesting approach in a discussion like this in particular, to actually go with a background that has no books visible. At least I don't see any, certainly no bookshelf. I don't think I've ever seen this before, not in this sort of discussion. So this is a really risky approach because, compare that to Craig, for example, who has a very elaborate and quite, nice looking bookshelf or set of bookshelves behind him. Just trying to sort of see exactly what he's got there. This is a thinker statue by the look of it. A couple of photographs, a very broad selection of books. I like the way that they're actually standing upright. I don't like the stacked books, as I've critiqued before. I think that's a bad way to do a bookshelf. They do appear to be the odd sort of piece of paper or portfolio, whatever it is, sort of slotted inside between the books. Got to take some marks off of that because it looks a little bit tacky and just kind of breaks the nice alignment of the books. I can't really see any of the titles, but there is a fair bit of variation in color, so that's pleasing. That being said, there are some things that aren't books on the bookshelf, which I also think is bad form. So I'm going to give that a 7 out of 10 for Craig. It's a very good effort, but not quite perfect. Obviously, I can't give Scott a rating here because not going with any bookshelves, compared to, particularly when we put it in contrast with Craig's very solid effort, is it's bold. Let's put it that way. It's bold. I've already ranked Cameron's current setup, so I won't comment on that again. So let us continue.
On this, I want to get directly into the dialogue because we don't have longer than an hour today. Also, let me mention this before we get started, is that we probably aren't going to have time for questions. As much as I would love to do some Q&A with these two, we don't have time to do that. But with that out of the way, let's go ahead and just jump straight in. Dr. Craig, give us what we're going to do today. Is we're going to have a dialogue about, it's sort of an open-ended, friendly conversation about the Kalam cosmological argument. So what I thought was best is if we start with just a short summary presentation from Dr. Craig of what this argument is, and then at that point we'll jump into dialogue. Scott will he's got some objections to the argument, and we'll run through some of those and just have a great dialogue. So Dr. Craig, why don't you start us off and give us that summary of the Kalam?
Certainly, thank you, Cameron. The Kalam cosmological argument is a very ancient form of the cosmological argument that goes back to the efforts of early Christian commentators to refute Aristotle's doctrine of the eternity of matter. And they developed various arguments for the finitude of the past. These arguments were then taken up into medieval Muslim theology when Islam swept across North Africa and evolved into a highly developed argument for the finitude of the past. The name of this theological movement in Islamic theology is Kalam. And so I dubbed the argument that was so characteristic of this movement the Kalam cosmological argument. It was then bequeathed back to the West through the intermediary of Jewish theologians and became a subject of hot debate, finally being ensconced in Immanuel Kant's first antinomy concerning space and time in his monumental critique of pure reason. The argument, as stated by one of its greatest medieval proponents, Al-Ghazali, is very simple. It basically has three steps. Premise one, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Or alternatively, an even more modest version of premise one would be to say that if the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause. Premise two is that the universe began to exist. This is the crucial premise of the argument. Medieval thinkers offered various arguments against the possibility of an infinite temporal regress of events. And in my own work, I've attempted to defend two such arguments against the eternality of the past. In the past century, however, we have found dramatic empirical or scientific evidence for the finitude of the past, both in contemporary cosmogony as well as in the study of the thermodynamic properties of the universe. Both of these fields of study provide dramatic scientific confirmation of the conclusion reached by purely philosophical argument alone that the universe began to exist. So in my work, there are these four independent arguments in support of the second premise, the universe began to exist. From those two premises, it follows that therefore the universe has a cause. And one can then do a conceptual analysis of what it is to be a cause of the universe. And a number of very theologically striking properties come out of such an analysis. The argument leads, I think, to the existence of a first, uncaused, beginningless, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe, which is, I think, a core conception of what we mean by God.
Well, thank you for that summary, Dr. Craig. So let's turn into just some open dialogue about.
So very standard presentation there, nothing really new. It is interesting that Craig didn't actually mention what either of his philosophical arguments were for the finitude of the past. He said that there were two of them, but then he mentioned, well, there are also two lines of scientific evidence, the cosmogony and what's the other one? Entropy. Well, thermodynamics, I think he said, but relates to entropy. So I don't know why he decided not to do that, but it's just an observation there. Other than that, pretty standard presentation. One thing I will mention is that the fact that he presented two forms of the first premise, the sort of standard, or I guess older form, if you look in his older works, which is that everything that begins to exist has a cause. And then he also mentioned a more modest form, which is if the universe began to exist, then it had a cause. That I've seen him use more recently, more frequently in more recent discussions, and I think, or debates, and I think that's interesting because it is a much more modest premise, and it is also all that you need in order to get the conclusion that you want. I think it's interesting that he shifted to that, or moving towards that, let's say, because I think that it's actually quite hard to defend the premise that everything that begins to exist has a cause. I think it's hard to defend the premise that the universe, if it began, had a cause, but it's even harder to say that literally everything. So I just think that that's an interesting observation that he's sort of shifted a little bit in that direction. But anyway, nothing else much to say there. Let's hear what. I'm also interested to hear what avenue Scott is going to take here. I gather that he's going to mostly challenge the first premise, the causal premise. But we'll see where it goes.
this argument? What are the merits of it, and maybe what are some good objections to this argument? So Scott, take us away. Let's just get into some good dialogue.
So cool. Well, just off the bat, I want to say a couple of things. One is that clearly, if there were ever proof of God's existence, it's the fact that I'm sitting here right now. I want to express my gratitude to both Cameron for arranging this dialogue and to Dr. Craig for his generosity with his time and the clear leap of faith. Cards on the table. I'm a soap actor and I have no philosophical training, so it's a leap of faith on Dr. Craig's part that this is not going to be a waste. I recognize what a rare privilege this is.
Yes, and often Craig is quite selective about the people he interacts with, so I actually do find it quite surprising. But anyway,
I recognize that I am in the presence of a great mind who has gone toe to toe with other great minds and won often. So my highest aspiration here is not to win a debate. That would be pretty foolish of me. But to create a document together that sort of maps out the assumptions and intuitions that can cause reasonable people to disagree about whether the universe is something that has a cause. And this dialogue may include me hearing for the very first time answers to my objections that are totally satisfying. I don't know what the response is to some of what I'm going to say here today, and to me that's very exciting. Okay, so that's all. I just wanted to get that out of the way and say that. Dr. Craig, if it's okay with you, I would like to. I'm genuinely agnostic on the truth of the second premise, whether the universe began to exist, and so I would like to grant, for the sake of argument, that the second premise is in fact true, that the universe did begin to exist, because I think that will corral us over to the first premise, which I think is one more interesting to me. I think you can just do so much with it, and I think it's under scrutinized. So that's I would like to do that. And as I understand it, you have 3 defenses for you.
So this is interesting. I suspected this was the case. I didn't know that he would go to the extent of granting the second premise. I think this is quite a good strategy, actually, at least potentially, because most discussions focus on the second premise, whether the universe began to exist, and that's what Craig's written by far the most about. He has written made some remarks in defense of the first premise, but I think that they're not nearly as developed. Craig thinks that the first premise is just obvious, and I mean, he said slightly different things at different times. Basically, he thinks that no sensible person who's thought about it really can actually disagree with the first premise. We'll see if he expresses that quite so strongly here, but he's definitely said that in other debates. Whereas I think the first premise is highly speculative, and we don't really have a good notion of what causation even is, let alone justification for extrapolating it out to having to apply to all types of things, or like universes or whatever. So let's see what direction Scott goes in here. I'm interested.
Your first premise. One is a sort of inductive argument, right? I mean, you look around the world, things have causes. There appears to be no exception to this rule. By the way, Dr. Craig, if at any point I'm misrepresenting you or I've got you wrong, I prefer that you actually interrupt me, because I don't want to talk past you a second longer than I have to. The second argument, as I understand it, is like you could call it like a chaos argument, right? It's in the Reductio family, and it's sort of like, well, okay, if that first premise is false, then it becomes inexplicable why anything and everything doesn't just pop into being uncaused out of nothing, right? And then the third argument, as I understand it, is a sort of appeal to our intuitions. We have this deeply held metaphysical intuition that out of nothing, nothing comes. And I was hoping that I could tackle the inductive argument first, because I think that induction doesn't get you there all the way to whatever begins to exist as a cause. And I think I can show that by offering an alternative causal principle that I just made up, but which I believe enjoys exactly as much empirical support. And I'll call it the double causal principle.
Yeah, so those are the 3 arguments that Craig gives. The induction over, things that we experience, what's called a reductio, so an argument that things just can't. If things can pop into being out of nothing, then why not anything? Why don't we just see that happening all the time? And the third is a sort of a rational intuition, or just sense, or whatever it is exactly, that it's just necessary that things that begin to exist have causes. Now, I think if you press Craig / look at what he's written about this, it's really the third argument that he finds persuasive. In fact, depending on when you ask, he will actually say that the reason, the main justification for the causal principle is not via induction over things that occur or the things we experience, but it's actually sort of a rational intuition or something to that effect. Although he does like to use the language of things popping into being from nothing, just being absurd, and that leading to why doesn't anything pop into being? So he does like to use that as well. Now, for people who've watched some of my stuff before or read anything on my blog or my book, they may know that I'm not very sympathetic to appeals to intuitions, rational or otherwise, when doing philosophical argumentation. I don't see any reason why I would expect our intuitions about such things to be correct. We know that our intuitions about space and time and other such matters are unreliable when it comes to many aspects of physics. So my intuition that, this table is solid is in a sense quite wrong, because most of it's actually empty space, which is not at all intuitive, right? We have an intuition that, time and space are absolute and immutable when relativity tells us that they're not. We have an intuition that objects can only be in one place at one time and precisely one place at one time, whereas quantum mechanics really does damage to that intuition, although it does depend a bit on how you interpret it. But no interpretation of quantum mechanics is going to recover all of our sort of pre-theoretic intuitions. And there's other areas as well, even in fields like psychology and economics and such, where we have intuitions that are just very incorrect. It's Saturday afternoon here. Jefferson asking in chat. So I don't think intuitions are very reliable here. Our intuitions, it seems to me, are formed largely from our experiences growing up as children, and maybe also as moving into adulthood, with our interaction with everyday objects and states of affairs that we can sort of comprehend. I don't see why knowledge that's derived from that would somehow be able to be extrapolated to the depths of space and time and, things like the origin of the universe. Now, I suppose if you're not an empiricist like I am, but you're more rationalist, you might think, look, actually, our knowledge of causation doesn't come from sort of experience, but it actually comes from, I don't know, rational intuitions. I don't know why you would think that. I mean, I don't know if Craig would even say that, because it seems to contradict with the argument that Scott was just talking about the induction over stuff in the world. Like, if that's how we learn about causation, then that's obviously empiricism, not that's empirical. It's not what the rationalist would say if they were saying it's sort of innate or something. So I guess you could go down that line. We have some sort of innate or faculty of grasping causation or causal relations, or the metaphysics of causation, that doesn't require any empirical knowledge. I think that's a pretty hard sell. I don't even think that's true for mathematics, but mathematics is very different from causation. It's unclear whether the metaphysics of causation even are necessary. So you might say mathematical truths are necessary, but are causal facts about causation necessary, like true in the same in all possible worlds? Don't know. So I think that's a pretty strong claim to make, and that's about the only way I think you can defend appealing to intuitions about this, because otherwise there's just no reason at all to expect intuitions to be relevant to asking, like, what does the universe have to have a cause? Cause, as we know it, is a thing that exists in space and time with middle-sized objects. We can extrapolate to some extent outside of that, although even there, I think it's a bit risky. But when you apply it to like the very beginning of the universe, who knows? From my point of view, like, I just don't even, it's not clear whether the concept even makes sense. So I'll get more into that hopefully later, as if they dig into this in the debate. But I just, on the face of it, I don't think, just to summarize, Craig's three arguments, I think, are mostly actually just about appeals to rational intuitions or pre-theoretic intuitions. And I think that that's a really weak argument. Now, the one argument that Craig makes that doesn't appeal to any sort of intuition is this idea that we induct over our experiences about causation, and everything that we see has a cause, everything that begins to exist has a cause, so therefore we should conclude that everything does. So there are objections to that. Let's see where Scott's going with this.
Principle, right? So here's my principle. Whatever has an efficient cause of its existence has a material cause, and I think you can take that and you can sort of make it into a Parity Kalam argument, right? So that's the first premise. You can have a second premise that's something like, the universe has no material cause, conclusion, therefore the universe has no efficient cause of its existence. And if I can succeed in showing that there's symmetry here, right? Because this is, I believe that this principle enjoys as much empirical support, but that you would reject it, right? You have reasons for rejecting this. And I think that would show that we need a tiebreaker, right? And then we could, if I'm successful in that, we could move on to some of your other arguments, which are also really interesting.
All right. Let me ask you a question, Scott, to
Sure.
begin. Do you think that the causal premise of the argument is false or simply that it's unproven?
All right, I don't know why Craig's changing the direction here. That might become evident soon, but I just want to comment on what Scott just said. So, because he didn't define his terms there, but as I understand it, the efficient cause of something is essentially what we typically mean when we talk about causes in many contexts, especially like a scientific context. It's the thing that makes something happen. Um, the notion of a material cause is something like the stuff that the cause is made of, or the material substance that it's made of. Um, so what Scott is saying here is, if I've understood correctly, is that everything that we observe has that begins to exist has an efficient cause, like something that makes it happen, but also a material cause. So that the efficient cause is like made of something; it has some sort of substance to it, matter or energy or something. And therefore, we should conclude that efficient and material causes sort of always go together. Now, the origin of the universe can't have had a material cause if the universe is defined as being all of matter, like all of space and let's just say all of matter, energy and matter. Obviously, because then that would imply there's something that's matter outside of the thing that's all of matter, which doesn't make any sense. So standardly, you would think that there can't be a material cause of the universe, at least maybe depending on whether quantum events count as material, but putting that to the side for the moment. But therefore, if material and efficient causes always go together, and then the universe can't have had a material cause, then it follows that the universe can't have had an efficient cause. But that's what Craig wants to show, that the universe had a material cause. So I think that that's the logic of the argument, that we have just as strong inductive support for the, what do you call the double cause principle, that everything that has an efficient cause also has a material cause. And so Scott wants to put that forward as an alternative inductive generalization to Craig's inductive generalization. Well, not an alternative. Actually, he wants to combine the two, from which it would actually follow that the universe can't have had a cause. So it's a sort of a reductio against that. So I think that's the logic of it. I think I don't really buy into the metaphysics of like material causes. I think that that's just sort of a different thing. But I think that you can frame it in different ways. You could just say, look, everything that begins to exist has a material cause. That is a cause that is brought in, a cause that has in its essence or in its nature is some sort of physical interaction. And if that's true, then the universe can't have had a cause, right? If the universe is just all of materiality, so there's different ways you can do this. And the thing is that all of them are going to be inductively equivalent, because all of the causes that we observe are material, I think. Now, one may want to give objections to that if you're like a interactionist dualist or something, but then the burden of proof is on the person who's making that argument to demonstrate that there are such types of causation that are distinct from like material type causes. So anyway, let's see the line that Craig goes down here.
I think that it's false.
Really?
I think that it's false because, well, so when I think about causality, when I kind of start doing an armchair analysis of what causality is, it appears to have all these features, right? It appears to be a temporal and spatial process. It appears to take place by an interaction of an efficient cause with a material cause within time and space. I think something begins to exist only if there was a point in time before it existed, where it didn't exist yet, right? There's all these features of causality as we observe it in the empirical world that I think can't be exported to something like the universe, which is defined as the totality of material reality.
Okay, well now wait though. That would not necessarily mean that the causal premise is false. That's not a proof of its falsehood. You don't think, do you, that things can just pop into existence uncaused?
No, certainly not. So I don't think.
Oh, I turned my camera up by accident. Okay, so this is frustrating already from Craig. I know I'm pausing a bit early, but I suspect that Craig is going to make some rhetorical moves here, which will obfuscate any points where he maybe is weaker on. I don't know. Maybe Scott will do a terrible job, and Craig will have the upper hand here. I'm not assuming that. However, I have seen him do it in many other debates, and also in his written work as well. So I'm trying to sort of go a bit slowly and analyze carefully the direction Craig is taking. So what Scott said is that and this is quite similar to what I've said before as well, is that it seems from an analysis for causation, at least plausibly, that causes causes are things that occur in a universe. Like he mentioned that they occur in space and time, and that they involve sort of materiality in some form. It doesn't define what he means by that, but let's just assume it's like matter and energy or something, laws of physics or something akin to that, right? So they seem to have those properties. Now, it would follow from that there can't be causes outside of the universe. And if the cause of the universe had to be something outside of the universe, which I think would be a standard idea about the cause of the universe, then it actually does follow that the universe cannot have a cause. I don't quite understand why Craig is saying it wouldn't follow from that. I mean, it depends precisely how you want to formulate what Scott is saying, right? But I think if you formulate it, in a fairly simple way, basically Scott is saying causes are things that only exist inside a universe or the universe, but the cause of the universe would have to be outside of the universe. Therefore, if the universe had a cause, the cause would have had to be outside of the universe. Therefore, the universe cannot have had a cause. That seems fairly simple in terms of reasoning to me. Then obviously you need to discuss whether it is the case that causation is a thing that can only exist in a universe. I raised this point as well when I said, look, a standard notion of causation is that a cause is a relation between two events, which are basically spatiotemporal points. And if that's true, then I think plausibly, again, maybe you can argue about exactly what counts as an event, but plausibly, if events require time in particular, then the universe cannot have had a cause, right? Because that would be saying that the first event is somehow related to an event that happens to an additional event, which is the cause of that event, which doesn't really make any sense, right? So, like even if the cause and effect are simultaneous, you would still have to have a first cause, which then could not have had any prior event to that, which would be the cause of it, causally prior in that sense, rather than temporally. So I think it's actually very plausible for an analysis of causation that this is the case, that the universe cannot have had a cause, like metaphysically, based on an analysis of cause. And what Craig is doing is, instead of, well, I don't want to say instead, because maybe he'll bring it up later, but at least for the moment, instead of addressing that directly, instead he's pivoting and he's talking, you don't really think the thing can just pop into being without any cause, can you? Well, hang on. No one said pop into being apart from Craig, right? So that is a language that I've been very critical about, not just me, but others as well. Actually, I should grab my book here. So this is something I discuss in the section on the causal principle, where I discuss this in my book on reasonable faith. And Craig's use of the language of popping into being is, I think, is very misleading. It may even be dishonest, although I don't necessarily want to go that far, but it's very misleading because it doesn't make sense to say pop into being from something. Like, you can't, from is a two-place preposition, right? You have from somewhere to something, or from one state to another state. But if there's nothing, then there's no from, right? It's not like you pop into being from nothing. Like, nothing isn't somewhere that you can pop from. It's just begin. The universe would just start. It just wouldn't have a cause. It wouldn't pop into any. There's nothing for it to pop into, and there's nothing for it to pop from. The whole notion of popping into from doesn't make any sense. It's just meaningless verbiage. But it sounds nice. It's a good rhetorical device, and that's why I think Craig uses it so much. And I think it's really dubious to use it here, because Scott wasn't even talking about that. He was saying, from an analysis of causation, it seems that causes are plausibly things that only exist within a universe, not outside of it. Therefore, the universe cannot have a cause as a matter of principle. Craig's response is, you don't really think that things can pop into being from nothing, can you? Which is at best a straw man, and I think at worst just a dodge of the issue. So that's how I'd frame what's happened so far. Now, maybe Craig will, I hope he will engage with the point more substantively, but I'm already a bit disappointed by the evasive maneuver that he's adopted there. But let's see where the discussion goes.
I think that within the space-time universe, I think that, so here, I guess what I would say here is that I think that the scope of the causal principle is physical and not metaphysical, right? Yeah, exactly. So I think once you get to something like the totality of time and space itself, the causal principle breaks down, and I don't think we have good enough reasons for thinking it would apply to the universe itself.
Right. Okay. Now that's quite different. That's not an attack so much on the idea that something that begins to exist as a cause is the scope of the principle, that you don't want to allow it to apply to the universe itself. Now, there, I think one would want to hear what good reasons would disqualify the universe from lying within the scope of this principle. What is it about the universe that would allow it to come into being uncaused from nothing, but the things within space and time?
You can't come into being from nothing. Nothing is not a state or a place or a time or any of the other sorts of properties or substances that we would use the preposition from to apply to. It really annoys me that he insists on saying from. If he just said come into being causelessly or without a cause, that would be fine. But the from nothing is really, really misleading. There is no from, okay? The from isn't doing anything there other than misleading people and I think serving as a way to strawman the opponent's view. Also popping as well. Again, there's nothing to pop into. It's not like space was there and then the universe popped into it. There wasn't anything sans the universe, right? Or maybe God, but like there wasn't some stage that the universe popped into on. But anyway, let's continue. I'm hoping that Craig will actually give a sort of a focused maybe not refutation at least, but a response to the actual point instead of just continually saying, yeah, but it can't pop into being from nothing.
Couldn't do that. I can't think of any germane feature of the universe that would make it plausible that the entire universe could just come into being uncaused. Now, you did mention one. You said anything that, well, that's not even right. I was going to say, you said anything that begins to exist, there has to be a time before it.
Yeah,
at which it
it's
did
not
not exist. But that's an attack on the second premise, not the first one. And I think that that principle is false anyway. It would preclude that time had a beginning. If you say that for something to begin to exist, there has to be a time before it during which it did not exist, that would mean that time could never begin to exist, because it would be a self-contradiction to say there was a time before time at which time did not exist.
Yeah, that's why, Craig, you shouldn't. So I agree with that, but that's why Craig shouldn't use the language of popping into being, because it implies a space or time or some sort of state in the absence of the universe. Because again, otherwise, what is from doing there? What does from mean? When else do we use from that preposition in a way where there's not some relation between states that you move from one to the other, where it's physical state or a psychological state or an abstract state? So I feel like he's arguing against himself here. But anyway, he's also moving against the point. Let's keep going for a bit, and I'll offer some more commentary in short order.
And yet this is commonplace in contemporary cosmology to talk about the beginning of time and space. So I think all you have to do is to say that something begins to exist at a time t if there is no time earlier than t at which that thing exists. And that would allow time to begin to exist without being self-contradictory. And it would also say that things do begin to exist without there being this sort of empty time before they come into being. So I don't think that principle applied to the universe would be disqualifying for the universe to lie within the scope of the causal premise.
Right. So I should clarify some things here. So it's not that that's my argument, right? My argument here, or my objection here, is not that the universe didn't begin to exist because there was no time, prior to the universe's existence. What I was trying to do there was show that there are all these features of something being caused to exist within our empirical experience of the world that you actually have to sacrifice. You have to jettison those features when it comes to the universe. So, for example, when we see things beginning to exist, or when we see things caused to exist, we see that it's by the interaction of an efficient cause with a material cause. We see that it takes place within time and space. There is also this, what to me intuitively seems essential to causality, is the affect-effect relationship, right? So you have a cause which affects something, and from the interaction of the first two, you have the effect, right? And so that you have to get rid of, when it comes to something like creatio ex nihilo. So I'm saying that there are all these features of causality as we know it that to me seem essential, right? And you would disagree with that. You would say, well, no, those things are clearly not essential, because we need a cause of the universe, and you can't have, you can't have time before time, you can't have space before space, and so on and so forth. So we clearly have different intuitions about what aspects of our empirical experience of the world we have to get rid of.
Let me predict where, at least part of where Craig's going to go here, because I would say, I think that Scott is pulling on a good thread here of the argument. I think that is, I don't actually talk as much about an analysis of causation in my book, although I do talk about quite a few of the issues that they mention here. But increasingly, I've been interested in the metaphysics of causation, like what is it for something to cause something else, and what type of relation is the causal relation. And as I said, I think that if you look at this in the literature, the most common analysis is that causation is a relation between a cause and an effect. So there's two causal relata, and that the type of those things are that they're events. An event is something that happens in a particular time and place. if that is true, then at least plausibly, you just can't have a cause of the universe, right? Because there aren't events outside of the universe. Again, plausibly. I mean, maybe you could construct a notion of event that doesn't require it to have a time or a space. But if you understand an event as like a spatiotemporal event, which again I think is pretty standard, then they just ain't no causes outside the universe. It doesn't make sense, right? It's like asking what's north of the North Pole. There aren't spatiotemporal events outside of the set of all spatiotemporal events, which plausibly is a way to characterize the universe, and Craig has characterized it that way. And causes, if they're a thing that happens with by relating spatiotemporal events, you're not going to have causes outside of that nexus, right? So I think that this is, I phrase it in a slightly different way to Scott, but I think it's substantively the same. I think that one aspect of where he is, I don't want to say erring, but could be, that I would have done differently here is just pick one or two things specifically instead of mentioning a whole bunch of them together, because he's mentioned the space and time thing in addition to mentioning the fact that there's an interaction between a material cause and efficient cause, and I think one or two other things that I forget. I think it's going to be easier for Craig to brush past those rather than if you just presented one to start with of them very firmly and press him on that as like, well, okay, it seems that causes have this property, say being events, spatiotemporal events, that the cause of the universe cannot have. So that's a reason for thinking that the universe isn't the sort of thing that could have causes in principle. But I mean, that's a sort of a small nitpick. So anyway, hopefully Craig will respond to that. However, Scott's also said something else here. He said that, look, we have different intuitions about what properties causes need to have, or what sort of things we need to keep, and what things we need to jettison when it comes to talking about the origin of the universe, or the properties of the cause of the universe. Now, I'm going to guess that Craig is not going to accept that characterization, because he typically, I mean, this is just a guess. If I'm wrong, then I'm wrong, but I think it's interesting to think about this. I don't think he's going to accept the characterization that they're trading off against intuitions. Craig, I can't recall him doing that. He doesn't usually admit to the idea that you may rationally disagree with him because you have different intuitions. He'll usually want to give a reason as to why his are sort of rationally preferred, although he won't say my intuitions are rationally preferred, but he's going to problematize something that Scott has said, I'm going to predict. So he's not going to accept the idea that, oh yeah, okay, look, there's different intuitions about this. He's going to say, well, there's a problem here, or with something Scott said, or what he's going to do is just sort of dig his heels in and say, well, yeah, but I don't really see why we should expect that causes will have, like a causation has to have any of those things. Those are just accidental properties of causes that we see, or something along those lines. Let's see if my prediction is correct. I'd be very happy to be wrong, by the way, because I don't think those are good responses. But
sacrifice. That was the point I was making there.
Yes. Now, what I would say with respect to everything that has an efficient cause also has a material cause, that does have very powerful inductive evidence. There's no doubt about it. But the question is whether or not this is simply a common feature of our experience, or whether this is an essential feature of efficient causality, that it always acts on a material cause. And I think probably we could find counterexamples even within the realm of our experience as to when we do have efficient causes operating without material causes. And the most evident of these would be when the cause is an intellectual agent or mind who produces thoughts. In that case, you have causality by a personal agent of mental events, but one doesn't need to have, or they're not.
Ben asked, why don't I watch the video beforehand instead of speculating on what Craig might say? Well, basically because I think it's fun to do it this way. It's interesting to think about what avenues he might take. But anyway, I do different videos different ways, and I decided to do this one this way. But anyway, yeah, as David says, guessing what someone will say is a way to check that you understand the position and tactics. So yeah, I mean, it's sometimes I watch it beforehand, sometimes not. I just thought it'd be interesting to do it this way. Plus, I find it difficult to listen to Craig. For various reasons, right? I've listened to so much of him over time, so I have to ration out my Craig budget. Anyways, so I guess correctly in one respect. So I did predict that he would challenge that some of what Scott said is some of the properties he mentioned are necessary, and he's saying no, that they're actually not necessary, and he's offering some counterexamples. I suspected he might offer this one because this is what Craig discusses in his book about the properties of agent causation. Now, it's interesting because this is, again, I argue this in my book. the Kalam is absolutely dependent on agent causation. The way that Craig typically defines the Kalam is simply consisting of the two premises: everything that begins to exist has a cause, and the universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause. That in itself, on the face of it, doesn't say anything about agent causation, right? But I really just don't think you can actually get the argument to work with that agent causation. First of all, Craig brings in agent causation almost immediately when doing an analysis of the properties of the cause of the universe, and almost immediately we're talking about a non-material agent. So that's one point. But also, even here, even in its attempting to establish the causal premise, what's Craig doing? We're only 17 minutes in, and he's already appealing to the notion of agent causation. I don't know if he used that language, but that's what he's talking about here when he's talking about an agent causing an effect. Which is an alternative, which I would say is a very fringe view about the metaphysics of causation, or a type of causation that can exist. Now, just because a view is fringe in philosophy doesn't mean you can't hold to it. I hold some views that are fairly controversial myself. So that's fine. It's just, I think it's good to be aware of the fact that something that Craig is presenting as being just overwhelmingly obvious from his intuition, actually, when he gets to defending it, not even that deep into defending it, he's appealing to these really fringe, and I think many people would say hard to defend, philosophical positions about the nature of causation. Agent causation is a very strange beast. It requires this idea that substances can be causes, and not just substances particularly, but like immaterial agents, which, I mean, someone like me, and I'm guessing Scott, don't even believe exist. So this, not only is this risky metaphysically and difficult to defend, I think, but also it's going to be completely unpersuasive to someone like me or Scott who doesn't accept that there are immaterial agents or substances of this sort that can stand in a causal relation to things. So it's sort of unclear what this response is supposed to achieve, because I just don't think it's going to be persuasive to someone who doesn't already accept that. I have a little more to say on why he might deploy that, but let's continue listening.
They don't have any sort of material cause. Thoughts are not constituted out of matter or stuff.
Yeah, so there you go. Thoughts are not constituted out of matter or stuff. Now, does Craig think that Scott agrees with him on that? Does Craig think that most atheists agree with him on that? Does Craig think that most philosophers agree with him on that? Right? The answer to all of those questions should be no, because Craig's smart enough to know that not only most atheists, unfortunate pause, not only most atheists, but also most philosophers don't think that thoughts are not made out of material. So I mean, he said constituted by. So I guess there's a lot of quibbling you could make about what that means. But in the sense that Craig means as an immaterial substance that has causal powers, absolutely most philosophers do not think that thoughts are like that. Though there's property dualism and other sort of non-reductive materialism and complicated views there that it gets a little tricky. But I don't think those are going to help Craig, because they don't give like thoughts sort of non-material causal powers, which is what's important here for this argument. So again, what is this objection supposed to achieve? I assume that Scott's going to jump in here and say, well, I don't believe that there are such things, so how does that help your argument? Anyway, let's see.
And so that would provide a counterexample to the claim that efficient causes are necessarily, rather than simply commonly, accompanied by material causes.
Yes. So yeah, there's some ambiguity with respect to the phrase material cause, and the sense in which I understand it, which I think is the Aristotelian sense, is that the material cause, it's not a synonym for physical cause. So I want to be that seems like an equivocation to me, right? Material cause does not necessarily mean cause that is physical in nature, cause that is made out of matter and energy. As I understand it, the material cause of a thing is just the stuff out of which it was formed, physical or otherwise. And so I'm stipulating that that's what I mean when I say material cause.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, so I think that fits with the. I mean, my knowledge of Aristotle is not expansive, so that fits with how I understand. I don't know how Aristotle sort of thought about the distinction between like that we would now draw between like materiality and non-materiality or something. I suspect it probably doesn't map exactly to how Aristotle thought about it. It's interesting though that I don't actually know that helps Scott's. Oh, welcome, Nathan. I don't know that actually helps Scott's position here, because if a material cause is not like physical necessarily, which is how I would sort of characterizing it, but if it's just like the substance that the cause is constituted by, then the universe would have a material cause under. Well, now I'm doubting myself. At least it may have a material cause under Craig's view, because the substance that made the universe was God, right? Now, I suppose you could say, well, yeah, but God is not like a material substance. But according to what Scott's saying, it doesn't have to be material. It just has to be like a thing, like a substance. And I think Craig thinks that God is a substance because because his view about agent causation involves is a form of substance causation as opposed to event causation. So I'm thinking kind of aloud here, but I'm pretty sure that Craig can actually just embrace that and say, okay, sure, if that's what a material cause is, then actually the universe did have a material cause. That material cause was God. I don't know if he's going to go down that road though, because Craig's not like an Aristotelian, so I don't know if he's going to buy into the metaphysics. I would have just liked to press the idea that, yeah, actually by material here, we just mean like physical or energy or quantum interactions or something like that. And then just reject Craig counterexample as being, well, I don't accept that. I mean, does that mean that I need to accept immaterial souls or minds in order to be convinced of the first premise of the Kalam? Because if that's so, the Kalam is not going to be very persuasive to a lot of people. Anyway, let's see the direction this goes down.
Okay, well, that isn't the classic understanding. I mean, for Aristotle, prime matter was the material cause of which things are made. So it was a very physical notion. If you allow...
Craig almost certainly knows more about that than me. However, I don't necessarily trust the way that he's describing it based on my other viewings of him. I don't know what prime matter is. I suspect that the way Aristotle thought about that is probably not how we currently think about matter in terms of science. But I don't know that it matters that much. Let's see the direction that Craig takes.
That thoughts have material causes. Well, then what's the problem with divine causation of the world? Because God is a personal agent who has thoughts and has will and intentionality, and he can will that the world exists. And as an omnipotent being, the world comes into being. So, I mean, if that's what you mean by material cause, then that principle isn't sacrificed in having a transcendent cause of the universe.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I was saying. So this is why I thought this is actually fun trying to guess the steps. Nathan says prime matter is purely actual or something, or purely potency. Yeah, that sounds right. I just, maybe I'll get around to reading more Aristotle at some point. I just don't really find it very interesting, but it comes up a lot. Anyway, but this was my prediction about what Craig would say. He didn't explicitly say God is a substance, but he basically said, well, okay, if that's what you mean by material, then sure, like immaterial thoughts can count as a substance from that point of, it can count as a material from that point of view. So I think this was a mistake from Scott, but maybe he'll correct and have a good counter.
So one thing that I believe that you and I have in common is that we would both identify as nominalists. As I understand the Kalam cosmological argument, what we're really talking about here is the beginning of existing of concreta, right? We're not talking about abstractions. We're not talking about events. We're not talking about mental events such as thoughts or concepts. So we're not talking about...
I'm not exactly sure like an event is an event of concretia. I don't know. I guess it depends who you ask about that. I've read different things about that. Like mental events, I'm happy to say a mental event is a concrete thing. Mental, like concepts are not necessarily concrete things. I guess instantiations of concepts are. This gets a bit abstract, right? Because there's a difference between types and tokens. So if I have a thought in mind, like 1 + 1 = 2, that specific thought that I have in my mind is a token of that, say, proposition. It's a particular like example of it or instantiation of it. Now, presumably that exists, right? Because like there's something in there, presumably, which if you're some sort of physicalist about the mind is ultimately going to be reducible to some sort of neural activity or neural structures. Whereas so that token, that's a concrete thing. But the type, the proposition 1 + 1 = 2, as a sort of a type, a set of things, that's maybe not a concrete thing. That's sort of an abstraction that we sort of describe a bunch of things with. So that's a bit controversial. But I guess I'm a bit dubious about some of the examples being given here as not concrete here. And I feel like Craig might... because Craig doesn't give you the benefit of the doubt, in my experience. I don't really see him, not at least when he's sort of discussing things with people he disagrees with. So if there's something he can pick on, he's going to pick on that. So I don't know if that's going to be relevant, but I'm also not sure why Scott's going in this direction. I don't know how this helps him. We'll see.
About universals, we're not talking about numbers. We're talking about concrete objects, right? So when I say whatever, I'm really saying whatever concrete thing that has an efficient cause of its existence has a material cause of its existence, right? And so the the universe is not like a thought, right? The universe is a concrete object, and in our experience of the world, when we see concrete objects begin to exist, it's always by the interaction of an efficient cause with a material cause in our experience.
Again, I feel like there's probably metaphysical room to move in here, but I don't like this direction because is a thought not a concrete thing? I would say it's a concrete thing. One way to test this is by if you distinguish abstract objects from concrete objects. An abstract object, I mean, there's different definitions of this, obviously, but things like numbers or sets, or even properties like yellow or yellowness. One way to define the abstract objects would be to say that they don't have causal powers. And, because like the number 5 doesn't cause anything, or yellowness doesn't cause anything. The fact that some particular set of 5 things is 5 and not 6 may cause something, but that's different from 5-ness, right? You see the distinction there. That's a little bit like the type token, although not exactly. But anyway, the point is that I would say thoughts can cause things. Now, that is controversial because some people think that thoughts are epiphenomenal, but I think that a lot of people would say thoughts can cause things. So I'm not sure that they're not abstract entities, right? So I don't think that Craig's going to admit that thoughts aren't a counterexample because they're not concrete, because they're not abstractions. They could be epiphenomenal and therefore not have causal power. That epiphenomenal means that like the brain causes thoughts, but thoughts don't cause anything. So they just they're caused, but not the causes of anything. So under that idea, they're not abstract objects, but they're not, they don't have causal powers, I suppose. I don't know how popular that view is. I think it's a bit silly to think that thoughts don't cause things, but I don't think Craig's going to like this objection. Let's see what he says about this. Yeah, so David makes a good point. There's many different ways to cash out these things. And a lot of it, 90% of it is just deciding how words apply. I don't know if it's 90%, but it is a lot. This discussion should be done with taboos on all words only philosophers ever use. Look, maybe. I don't necessarily say that, because a lot of the words are pretty, like concrete. I mean, we use that word, something concrete. Causation, we use that term. Abstract, we use that term. A lot of the terms that philosophers use are words that ordinary people use. Not all of them, to be sure, but a lot of them are. And they're just sort of, as you say, cashed out differently. So I think it's more about being clear about definitions that's important here. So it is tricky. And when giving comments, I try to illustrate that there's different avenues to take it, but while also sort of trying to highlight it, maybe things that are more standard or a typical way of looking at it. And I think a pretty typical way would be to say that thoughts are concrete, at least in a sense, and not abstract objects. They can have causal powers, and so I don't know that you can get around it in this, get around the objection that Craig is raising in this way. Let's see what he says about it then.
Yes. Well.
Uh-oh. I think I lost.
That wasn't me. Audio. That wasn't me.
Yeah, Dr. Craig, we lost your audio for just a second. So just repeat the last thing you said.
Oh, yeah, you're good.
Well, I was just going to comment that would at best show that this is a common feature of mundane causes, rather than that this is an essential feature of causality as such. It seems to me that if you have a personal agent who transcends the world, that agent can, by thinking, bring into reality concrete objects like the universe. Now, one of the difficulties with the argument, Scott, that you're propounding, it seems to me, would be that it leads to a sort of double absurdity. In the case of the universe, if the universe began to exist, then on the view you're suggesting, it would have neither an efficient cause nor a material cause. On my view, at least it has an efficient cause.
So it looks like Craig's, it's fine, David. It looks like Craig's audio and video have gone out of sync. I'm pretty sure that's on the video's end and not on my end. So just in case you're looking at that and finding it distracting.
That explains why it comes into being, even though it doesn't have a material cause as you define the term. And so while I grant you that inductively, our common experience shows that efficient causes work in cooperation with material causes, to deny that with respect to the beginning of the universe leads to a situation that, far from being more plausible than my view, is doubly absurd, because it says the universe came into being with neither an efficient nor a material cause.
Yeah, I appreciate.
That's a terrible objection, right? Because the whole point of Scott's comment, as he said earlier, is it's supposed to be a reductio or something similar to that against using these inductive inferences in the first place, right? Because if we can get to a different result using apparently the same sort of inductive reasoning, then that's reason to be skeptical that the inductive reasoning is actually valid or is appropriate. It feels like that response completely misses the point. It's supposed to get you an absurd result. That's like illustrating how this type of induction seems to have gone wrong. Anyway, let's see if that's how Scott responds.
Appreciate that argument. My view is that commits a kind of category error. It's viewing an acausal beginning through the lens of causality, right? So an analogy would be, hitting a home run without.
I think we need to ban category error as a term. It just seems to be that it's abused so much. I mean, maybe this is just my opinion, but to say that something is a category error can be a relevant point to make, but you really need to explain why it's a category error, because often people are just going to disagree about how to categorize things. And so it's sort of like just saying you're wrong without, I mean, I'm not saying that Scott is playing it wrongly here necessarily, but I don't know. That's why I cringed a bit when he said that. Also, yeah, I feel like it would be better for him to just focus on this point and say, look, the whole point that we can get to different and potentially contrasting or doubly absurd results by applying the same inductive reasoning is reason to be very skeptical about this whole process of applying inductive logic to, try to work out the cause of the universe. I feel like that's a stronger point than this category error stuff. Although I should let him finish, I suppose, but it doesn't seem promising to me.
Out a ball is absurd, but hitting a home run without a bat or a ball is doubly absurd. Right? Universe being likewise, the universe being caused to exist without a material cause is absurd, but without an efficient and material cause is doubly absurd. The problem is that I'm not claiming to have hit a home run, and I'm not claiming that the universe was caused. So you would have it would be doubly absurd if you're positing that the universe was caused to exist without an efficient cause or a material cause. But I'm not positing that the universe was caused to exist in the first place, so I'm not claiming to have hit a home run either.
Yeah, I don't think that's a pertinent analogy. The home run here is the beginning of the universe, and you do believe that the universe existed in the past, and for the sake of argument, began to exist. So you've got the ball going over the fence on your view. Now, the question is there a causal explanation of that? And I would say that it's more plausible to say it's got an efficient cause that produces it than to say it has no cause at all, that it's completely acausal, which is what you're committed to.
So I disagree that the home run here is that the universe began to exist. If the home run here is that the universe began to exist, and we're saying it's absurd that it didn't have an efficient cause and doubly absurd that it didn't have a material cause, then you're begging the question in favor of the universe requiring a cause. But if you say that what the home run here is that the universe was caused to exist without an efficient cause or a material cause, then you get your double absurdity. But otherwise, you're just assuming the truth of the conclusion that the universe needed a cause, to my ear.
Well, but look at your argument. Your argument is that in the case of the universe, I'm positing an efficient cause without a material cause. And I'm suggesting that while that's unusual, you've not shown any sort of absurdity in it. You've just shown that that's not the way mundane causes work. But that leads to the absurdity that something came into being out of nothing. And that's contrary to the first argument that I give for the causal principle, is that it's metaphysically impossible that being should come from non-being. And so there needs to be some sort of cause. In fact, Scott, if you look at the argument doesn't really specify what sort of cause the universe has. It just says whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. So the universe has to have some kind of cause. And then we can investigate, well, what kind of cause was it? It was certainly efficient. Was it also material? Well, no, it can't be that, because all matter and energy came into being at the beginning of the universe. So,
but again, that's treating material cause like a physical cause, right? You could have had God creating the universe out of some non-physical material cause, some ectoplasm or some
you better not
existing stuff.
You better not admit that, or your argument goes by the board, because then that's what I could say.
Well, yeah, but you believe in the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, so you wouldn't say that the universe has a material cause of its existence. I think that would be
theologically, I wouldn't say that. No,
right.
But
well, unless you understand material just to be any sort of substance, in which case, as Craig pointed out before, you could say God or God's thoughts or something with the cause. But again, I don't think that's super important here. Let me just go a bit further forward in there, sort of back and forth here, and I'll make some more comments.
But the point is that the argument itself doesn't tell you what kind of cause the universe has. It's only when you get to the conclusion and you analyze, well, what is it to be a cause of space and time, matter and energy, that you get to the conclusion that this doesn't have a material cause in the typical sense. And so it forces you to adopt this very peculiar view that here we have a case of efficient causality without material causality. And all you're able to show against that is that that's unusual, but not that there's any kind of conceptual problem with that.
This is just really frustrating. What does it mean to show that there's a conceptual problem with something? Craig's whole argument, really, for the fact that the universe needs a cause is he just can't imagine how it could be the case that it couldn't have a cause, right? That's him showing there's a conceptual problem with there not being a cause. I guess he does give the argument about things popping into being from nothing and why not anything, but I think that's a very weak argument. So Scott could just say, it seems implausible to me that something so the universe could come into being without a material cause. And therefore, if Craig claims that it did, then that should just be rejected, right? Because there's a conceptual problem with it. If that's all we're going to do, sort of appeal to intuitions in this way, then I don't see how Craig's any better off than Scott or anyone else when they say something else about causation. And furthermore, Craig's shifting the burden of proof here, as he usually does. He wants to say that he has shown that there's a conceptual problem with the universe not having a cause, even though I don't think he really has. He's just sort of asserted that it is. But then when Scott tries to say, well, actually, inducting, just as you're doing, it seems that, things that begin to exist have material causes and they have these other properties as well, that wouldn't apply in the case of the beginning of the universe. Therefore, maybe it seems actually that the universe didn't have a cause. What does Craig say? He says, well, you haven't shown that causes must have those properties. This is what I predicted Craig would do earlier. He's doubling down on that now. He's saying, look, those are just sort of accidental properties, or that they're common, right? But they're not like essential properties. But how is Craig? So he's saying, you haven't met my standard. You, Scott, have not met my standard for showing that causes have to have these properties, right? But how has Craig met his own standard for showing that, everything that begins to exist has to have a cause? What has he given to show us that must be the case? He's given a weak argument from induction, which Scott has parodied, and Craig hasn't really responded to how his induction is better. And he's given an appeal to intuition, basically, just saying, well, it just seems obvious that it must be. Those are the main arguments that he's given. So I don't see how Craig can put himself on a pedestal here and say, actually, I've shown that the universe must have had a cause because, it's conceptual problems with it not being so. Whereas you, Scott, haven't actually shown that. You've just shown at best that, things usually have material causes. Because Scott's done exactly the same thing that Craig does. He's made a sort of an inductive argument and presented some sort of general, he's presented his intuition and some other sort of general considerations in virtue of which he thinks that it's better to think of it his way than Craig's way. That's exactly what Craig's done. That there seems to be a symmetry between the type of arguments the two are giving. There's some inductive points that they're making. There's some sort of intuition that they're appealing to, and there's a few other considerations. Craig could at this point say, look, my intuitions are differ on this point. But as I predicted, he doesn't want to say that. He wants to claim that Scott has not established what he's trying to do, the point that he's trying to make, even though actually Craig has really done pretty much exactly the same thing that Scott has done. But as Craig almost always does, he sets different standards for himself to the other person. Craig is allowed to use his inductive argument and an appeal to intuition, but Scott is not allowed to do that, because when Scott uses an inductive argument that it leads to a contrary conclusion to Craig, and when Scott appeals to his intuitions, which are different about the nature of causes, well, that's not sufficient. That's just showing that it's unusual, or he hasn't shown that there's an absurdity. But Craig can do that. No, that's fine. This is really frustrating, because it's hard to see this unless you sort of kind of know the subject matter and really pay close attention. But Craig's, I think, clearly setting a separate standard there. He hasn't shown why what Scott has done as a sort of a general approach in terms of appealing to intuition and induction is really substantively different to what Craig himself does, but yet he wants to accept his reasoning and reject Scott's. And I don't see that Craig has really made it clear why we should do that.
Right. So I think that there's parity here, right? So,
yeah, that's what I'm saying.
When it comes to you saying,
that's what Scott is saying. There's parity.
Everything that begins to exist has a cause. Well, I don't know if things that begin to exist having causes is an essential feature of if having causes is an essential feature of things beginning to exist, or a common feature of things beginning to exist. Likewise, on my view, it's not clear that having a material cause is an essential feature of things being caused to exist, or an accidental or a common feature, as you put it. One thing that I always took note of in your defense of your argument is that you do, your first premise is ambiguous with respect to whether that cause has to be efficient or material, and that runs afoul of my intuitions in a way to treat something beginning to exist as if it could have either, it could have a material cause. If it doesn't have an efficient cause, it should at least have a material cause. But That's strange to me, right? Like if you and I went to a museum together and we were looking at a beautiful marble statue, and I turn to you and I say, Dr. Craig, what caused this statue to begin existing? And you say, marble. I wouldn't feel like you had answered my question, because material causes are not really what we're thinking about when we say that such and such was caused to exist. And so it seems strange to me, if you can have something beginning to exist, if your argument allows for something to begin existing with a material cause without an efficient cause, to borrow some of your phrasing, it becomes inexplicable why things don't just begin to exist.
But isn't that the opposite of what Craig is saying? Isn't Craig saying that things can have an efficient cause without a material cause? So I'm a bit confused as now to why Scott's saying that Craig is saying that things can have a material but not an efficient cause. Maybe I've missed that part. Like, I felt that Scott was saying exactly what I would have said, right? That there is a parity or a symmetry, as I said, between their cases and the type of argument that they're making, appealing to intuition, appealing to induction, and they're just sort of grasping at different principles here. I feel like that this reference to material without efficient causes is kind of the opposite to what he wants to say. It seems that what Scott wants to say is that he doesn't think you can have efficient causes without material causes, whereas Craig, it seems, wants to say that you can. And then the point is, how does Craig know that that's not a relevant consideration, like a necessary fact about causation? Craig wants to say, no, that's just accidental, but he wants to say, well, it is necessary that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Whereas Scott wants to say, well, actually, no, maybe they're both essential, right? And how can you kind of pick? That's the sort of question. How can you pick which are the essential and which are sort of the accidental or common properties? I think that is the best way to approach this, is to really hammer we are using the same strategy but coming to different conclusions. So why, Craig, is your particular identification of what is, the correct analysis of causation to be preferred? Because you don't appear to be able to methodologically distinguish, which properties are essential and which are accidental, or which intuitions are the correct ones. I feel like Craig is probably just going to say that he doesn't think that you can have a material cause without an efficient cause. Let's see.
With material causes without efficient causes all the time, right? You would need an explanation for why that is.
Well, that's an interesting point. Whether something could have a material cause but not an efficient cause. But again, that's not germane to the case at hand, because in the case at hand, with the universe beginning to exist, there can't be a material cause in the normal sense of the word. And so the alternative, it seems to me, Scott, is you've either got to deny that the universe began to exist, or you've got to say that it came into being without a cause. And when I think of those alternatives...
Yeah, so as I said, he just, Craig shrugged that off by saying, well, no, the universe didn't have a material cause, but it must have had an efficient cause. So he's essentially ignored... well, he didn't ignore part of what Scott said. He didn't ignore everything, but I think he ignored the key, what I would regard as the thrust of the argument, which is, how do you establish, on the basis of the techniques that Craig is using, which is essentially induction and intuition, what are the essential and what are the non-essential properties of causation, or aspects of causation? And Craig needs to have a specific set of answers to those. So, for example, although Scott hasn't said it this way, I would say that an essential property of causation, like plausibly, I'm not 100% committed to this, but I think it's plausible, is that cause is a relationship between spatiotemporal events. Now, if that's metaphysically necessary, then it means that there just can't be a cause of the universe. It's just impossible, right? Now, obviously, I'd have to give an explanation as to why I think that that's a necessary aspect of causation, and I could give that case. I won't give it now, but the point is, if that's true of causation, then what Craig's view must be false, right? So it depends on the analysis you're going to give of causation, and Craig needs to show that his analysis is preferred. But if he just says, well, by induction, and if he just appeals to his intuition, those don't show that it's preferred, because people induct over different. Like I say, well, everything that we see has a spatiotemporal cause, so therefore everything has to have a spatiotemporal cause. I say my intuition points differently to yours, Craig. So how has Craig established that his analysis is to be preferred? And I think that he's skillfully avoided giving a clear answer to that question. Partly, I think, drawing upon aspects of Scott's argument, which maybe I think misconstrued or failed to drive home the key point, or appeal to things that are not essential, in my opinion, at least. But anyway, and so what Craig is saying now is, look, either the universe didn't begin, or it began without a cause. And he's going to hammer home how absurd that is, I'm imagining. So let's see. We're about halfway through now, so let's see if the conversation goes in a slightly different direction.
It seems to me more plausible to deny that the universe began to exist than to say the universe came into being without a cause. To me, that's just metaphysically absurd.
That's just metaphysically absurd. So he's just appealing to his intuition again. So I say, look, it's metaphysically absurd that you can have a cause without a cause outside of space-time. What do we do now? We're just butting intuitions. This is why philosophy shouldn't be done, in my opinion, by appealing to intuitions. Intuitions can be a starting point, absolutely. I'm not saying just do away with them entirely. They can help us to think about things, but they shouldn't be justification for our positions, not primary justification for our positions, right? Because then, well, Craig has his intuition about what's metaphysically absurd. Scott has his, I have mine. Swinburne has his, Oppie has his, right? And we all, like, what's the point? We're just saying this is what I think based on, well, who knows what, like, because where do the intuitions even come from? So this is what I said. Craig's just gone back to, look, it seems to me that I am right, which is not actually an argument, but it certainly sounds persuasive, especially when he uses the language like popping into being from nothing, which, to be fair, he didn't hear, but he has before, and I guess he might again.
Yeah, it's because you and I have radically different intuitions about this, right? About what is essential to causality.
Yeah, as I was saying, that's what Scott is trying to drive at.
That a causal event took place, the creation of the universe, for example. We don't have to call it an event because that presupposes a sort of sequence, whatever you want to call it. But to say that something was caused in the absence of, the interaction of an efficient cause with a material cause. I mean, the idea here would be that an effect was produced without anything anywhere having been affected. Right. And that aspect of causality, as I understand it, intuitionally, it is indispensable. Right. So to me, that is a higher, to borrow a phrase that you've used that I find incredibly useful, that is a higher intellectual price tag than just saying, listen, for all we know, the scope of the causal principle is simply physical and not metaphysical, because the universe is not the kind of thing that could have a cause as we understand causes.
Yeah, that's basically what I think. And I think that there are reasons to prefer that. Scott hasn't really, well, he's given arguments that mirror Craig's, right? Intuition and induction, which I think are decent ones. I think you can give better reasons than that based on essentially a conceptual analysis of causation and appealing to quantum physics and other things. But that's a much longer discussion to have. And obviously that's just a particular view that I have. I've said before that under most conceptions of causation, the universe kind of had a cause. So there are process theories of causation which try to identify cause as something like supervening or being equivalent to some sort of a physical process, perhaps like a quantum process or conservation laws or something. If that's true, then obviously the universe kind of had a cause, because that only operates within like material space-time. There are regularity views of causation, which says that basically causation is just an identification of things that regularly co-occur. That's not really going to work for like the beginning of the universe, it seems to me at least, which has to be a singular event that can't really co-occur with anything. So I don't think the universe can have a cause under regularity views. There are probability raising views, which says that a cause is something that raises the probability of it's an effect. I'm not sure if that works for the universe or not, but it at least seems a bit hard to imagine what it can mean to talk about the probability of the universe beginning. So I'm not sure if that works or not, although it seems dubious. There are counterfactual views of causation, which says that a cause is something such that if in the absence of the cause, the effect would not have been produced. Now, that is one view of causation under which it makes sense to say that the universe had a cause, because it would just be the thing in the absence of which the universe wouldn't have been brought into bounds. And I've heard, I think once Craig appealed to this as a potential theory or idea of causation that would fit with his analysis. There's also a interventionist view of causation, which says that a cause is a hypothetically possible intervention which leads to the outcome variable changing. And again, it's hard to see how we can make sense of the idea of an intervention changing whether a universe begins to exist, at least not in a way that doesn't presuppose God in a kind of a strange way. So the point I'm making is that it's many standard views of causation, I think, disallow the cause of the universe, or at least make it kind of problematic and weird to understand how there could have been a cause of the universe under that view. And so Craig is actually, I think, especially when he appeals to that agent causation, which is actually another type of sort of beyond this again than what I've talked about, he actually requires a very particular understanding of what causation is and how it works in order for his argument to get off the ground, in my opinion. Whereas he makes it seem like, oh, I'm not making any assumptions about the nature of the cause. Well, of course you are, right? Because it doesn't even work. It doesn't make sense to ask about a cause if you actually pass it out in terms of many of the common theories. Not all of them, of course, but many of them. And I think it's frustrating that Craig just doesn't really acknowledge or want to deal with that.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I think we just have a real disagreement here on bedrock metaphysical principles.
Yeah, I agree.
Where would you like
Okay, that's actually surprising to me that Craig just sort of said that. Normally, I think he would press harder, possibly because this is not a sort of formal debate. It's interesting, though, that he didn't say that they disagree about intuitions. He said that they disagree about fundamental metaphysical principles, which is interesting. Yeah, I'm a little surprised that Craig let it sort of set there. I guess he sort of figured that they weren't really making progress on that. But anyway, we're halfway through, and we have only talked about kind of one aspect of the. We haven't really talked too much about the popping into being from nothing and why doesn't everything come into being from nothing. So I don't know if he's going to talk about that, but let's see where we go in the next part of it.
To go from here,
Yeah,
Matt, I didn't expect to get to a disagreement so quickly. Should we turn to the other? We could also talk about Scott. I don't know how developed your thoughts are on this, but the move that's made after the conclusion is reached, there's a cause of the universe, and we do this kind of conceptual analysis. I'm sure that you disagree with that. We could turn there if you'd like to stick here and talk about some other objections to premise one. How would you like to?
I would feel disingenuous taking on the argument about whether if the universe has a cause, that cause is a person, an omnipotent, omniscient person, because what I can't get around is the idea of something like the universe having a cause, right? So I can't. I don't even think that much about that because I'm still stuck. If I'm like this, if I were this perfectly neutral, perfectly rational audience to the Kalam cosmological argument, I imagine somebody going, okay, but I still don't understand why we should think that something like the universe itself, that the totality of space and time, which, by definition exists at all temporal points, by definition, has literally always existed, needs a cause. And there's different ways to unpack that. You can say that the universe.
It's disappointing that he didn't go down that route because I think that that's actually the least discussed aspect of the Kalam is the conceptual analysis of the nature of the cause, and actually the weakest as well. So it seems like Scott wants to just stay on the first premise here. It's interesting watching this and listening to what he's saying and picking out things that I'm pretty confident that Craig is going to take issue with, or at least that Craig would take issue with. Whether he brings it up is hard to say. I noticed that Scott mentioned that the universe, he said something about it existing at all points in time, or I forget the exact language. That doesn't sound like that Craig would agree with that because he's a presentist, right? So he doesn't think that the past exists. And the way that Scott just said that makes it sound like he was endorsing an internalist view or a tenseless view. I suspect they're probably not going to go down that road. But I guess the broader point I want to make about this is you have to be very, very careful, especially when dealing with Craig. Basically, it's often better to say less than more, because if you say something that Craig can pick on or force you to defend, then he can distract or divert the argument onto that point and put you on the defensive, often about things that aren't even that critical, or maybe you just misspoke. I think we've already seen that happen a couple of times, and I hope it doesn't happen here, right? But it's a matter of being very cautious if you're engaging these sorts of discussions. At least that's my impression based on debates that I've seen. But anyway, let's see where we go. I'm not entirely sure where they're going to take this.
Versus just necessarily, you can say it's a contingent proof fact. I understand that there's ways of looking at it in terms of A and B theory of time, but the one thing that you can't say is that the universe, popped into existence or came from nothing. That language to my ear is misleading and paints a picture much like the one of the tiger popping into existence in my living room behind me right here, right? Where our intuitions about that are pretty solid, but I don't think that can be exported to something that has literally always existed.
Well, I would disagree with that. I think on a tensed theory of time, according to which temporal becoming is real.
Called it. He's going into presentism.
The universe doesn't just have a front edge, so to speak, which is its beginning, in the way that a yardstick, say, has a front edge at the initial inch. Rather, on a tense theory of time, that yardstick.
Sorry to interrupt, but this illustrates exactly what I was saying. So Scott mentioned a couple of things. One of the things that he mentioned was about the language of saying things pop into being from nothing, which I think is a really good point and that could profitably be discussed, because I think Craig should be critiqued on this. He also then mentioned sort of theories of time. And Craig has written a lot about that, and there's so much to say in favor of presentism. And I think it's not ultimately persuasive, but there's certainly a lot to say about it, right? I think it's a lot more defensible than the language that Craig uses about popping as being from nothing. So, of course, Craig's going to go down the road of, actually, Scott's said something about endorsing eternalism or presupposing that or whatever it was exactly. So Craig's going to attack that. Unfortunately, that means that at least for the moment, the point about the language that Craig is using is left by the wayside. And now we're focusing on what Craig wants to talk about, which actually, although I think it's important, I don't know that it's relevant for this premise. which is that everything that begins to exist has a cause, or at least that the universe had a cause. I think it's relevant to the second premise that the universe began to exist, but at any rate.
It comes into being. And in that sense, it pops into being without a cause. That's what one means when one says from nothing. And that contradicts, I think, one of the most ancient and deeply rooted metaphysical principles of Western philosophy.
So
that goes all the way back to Parmenides, that being only comes from being, and that therefore something cannot come from nothing. And
So he's not addressing the language point. Obviously, something can't come from nothing. That doesn't make any sense. The question is that an appropriate way of describing a causeless universe? And it doesn't seem to be. Well, I mean, that's what Scott's point is. It's not an appropriate way to describe it. Also, to say that something like some Greek guy said it 2,000 years ago, therefore it must be true, is a really weak argument. I have said that that certain things are a standard analysis, but I'm quick to say, look, just because it's standard doesn't mean you have to accept it, but I think it does mean you should engage with the fact that it's a standard analysis and sort of think about the objections. But Craig's not even really saying that. He's saying that like some guy said it in the past. Like, I don't even know what it means to say that being only comes from being. Like that just seems to be underdetermined. I don't know that philosophers these days would, well, they probably would, I don't know, but that doesn't seem to be a well-formed problem in nearly the same way as, say, like a tenseless theory of time or something. So anyway, let's see if they get into this a bit more.
Avoid the argument's conclusion, we've got to believe that something, in this case, the entire universe, just came into being for no reason at all, no explanation. That just seems to me to be unbelievable.
So maybe
and you know, I'm not alone on this. I wanted to quote for you a passage from David Hume, of all people, in a letter he wrote to John Stewart.
Yeah, I don't care.
Rise without the cause source. In other words, what Hume was saying was
like Hume,
that he couldn't prove the causal principle, that anything that begins to exist has a cause, but he regarded its denial as metaphysically absurd. And so he believed the principle. And I would be very happy to simply say that the causal principle is a metaphysical assumption of the Kalam cosmological argument, so that anyone who shares this assumption should follow the argument to where it leads, that there is a cause of the universe.
Right. Well, if I understand the quote correctly,
that's so lazy. This is one of the worst ways of doing philosophy, which is to quote from authorities and just say, well, it's just sort of obvious. We just take it for granted. You know, that's basically it. That's not philosophy at all, really. That's just dogma. Look, as I've said, many standard views of causation would deny that the universe could have had a cause, or at least it's very hard for me to see how you can fit that within those frameworks. These two literatures don't seem to interact very directly, at least not in my experience. So I mean, there might be ways of working out, right? But at least prima facie, on the face of it, it seems that many standard views of causation, as I've just explained before, would not have anything to say about how the universe could have had a cause, because it just wouldn't make sense under that view. Likewise, the notion, the fairly standard view about the metaphysics of causation, which is that it's a relation between events, also doesn't allow the universe to have a cause. Again, at least in sort of standard ways of thinking about that. So is this so absurd in the way that Craig says it? No. I mean, he's quoting from figures who lived hundreds of years ago. He's not actually dealing with current contemporary discussion about the metaphysics of causation, what people have actually said about this, because I don't think he cares at all about this. I've never seen him interact with it at all in any of his written or written works or debates. He just wants to say, look, lots of people have thought this, which sure is true. I won't deny that, but lots of people have thought all sorts of things. So that's not really an argument for anything. And therefore, like, we just accept it as a principle. Now, it would be, I think the best approach here is to then push back and say, look, actually, there are good reasons for being pretty skeptical about the idea that everything that begins to exist has a cause, or at least being skeptical that we can be confident in that, right? And then you give some, basically, you give different analyses of the notion of causation, and try to make sense of the idea of what this would imply. And this, you can also get into what sort of cause would the universe have to have in order for it to have a cause. And it turns out, like, according to Craig, at least, it has to be some sort of ancient causation. And I would argue that this is an incoherent notion, or at least it's very hard to make sense of, and I think leads you to problems. And if that's true, then it's basically a reductio. If the only type of cause the universe could have had is one that doesn't really make sense, then that's a reason for thinking it didn't actually have a cause in the first place, right? So there's lots of avenues you can go down. I'm not going to get into all the details here. The point is, though, that Craig doesn't want to go down those roads. He doesn't want to really defend that. at least it seems to me, because he basically never does. He just wants to appeal to this idea that, look, it's just sort of obvious. Smart people have said it before. That should be enough for us. And I just think that isn't philosophy. That's appealing to dogma and just hoping people won't question it. I think absolutely there's rational disagreement about this, and there's many important ways that you can critique this. But Craig wants to present it as those atheists, they're just so unreasonable. They have to deny that things that can't pop into being from nothing in order to get around the Kalam. And I think that's just completely disingenuous. So that's why I'm really annoyed by that approach. Let's see what Scott says about this.
I'm certainly in agreement with Hume that it is an absurd proposition to think that anything could come into existence on cause. I don't believe that. I don't think that objects within the physical universe could come to exist on cause. And so I certainly don't believe anything could come into existence on cause. Oh, you made another point right after that was really interesting, and I already forgot it. This is why I'm not a good note taker.
No.
Anyway.
But what you do think is that something can come into existence without a cause, namely a universe.
Well, okay, so let me ask, okay, so why, is there an argument for why we should think that the scope of the causal principle is metaphysical and not merely physical?
That's a really good point, because it's not a physical principle. I think this is so important. It is a metaphysical principle, as I say, that underlies Western philosophy all the way back to the pre-Socratics. It's not like Boyle's laws or the second law or the conservation laws of thermodynamics or laws of gravitation. It's not a physical law that simply governs our physical space-time arena, but this is a metaphysical.
The standard view of causation. Look, I'll read from this, right? I don't know how, I feel like a broken record here. No, I always screw this up. So I need to stop that share before I can start a new one. And let's go to this. He said it's not a physical principle that governs something about our space-time. Let's see, Relato. Here we go. This is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article about metaphysical causation. I've made this point before, but I feel the need to make it again because of what he just said there, which I find really irritating. Now, I'm not saying causation is like a physical principle in the way that like Boyle's law is, but in the way that does it apply to space and time? Well, let's ask that question. What are the causal relata when the cue ball knocks the 9 ball into the corner pocket? What are the terms of this causal relation? The standard view of the causal relata is that they are the category event and that the number is 2 in the roles of cause and effect. So on the standard view, when the cue ball knocks the 9 ball, there is said to be an actual event of the cue ball striking the 9 ball and an actual distinct event of the 9 ball sinking into the corner pocket. So one event is the cause and the other is the effect. So the causal relata are a pair of events. Now, as it says here, of course, the standard view has been disputed on all counts. So I'm not saying you can't disagree with this. But what Craig is saying is basically the opposite. Like, you can't disagree with this, right? This is just a metaphysical principle that even David Hume agrees with. And that's, what do you say? It was a foundation of Western philosophy or whatever that's supposed to mean. I don't think there are any foundations of Western philosophy. Like, every single thing, there are foundational thinkers, but principles, like everything has been challenged all over the place. So when people say things like this, a foundational principle of philosophy or whatever, I just think that just treat that as hot air, right? Because I don't think there are foundational principles. You can talk about common analysis or a standard view. That's one thing, but like a foundational principle, I just think that's nonsense. But anyway, the point there is that it's pretty standard to think that causes are relations between events. And events, again, a standard way to think about that is that they're points in space and time, or they're things that happen in space and time. Now, you may disagree with that, but the idea that causes are things that happen in space and time is pretty standard, right? Craig actually is one who's saying, no, that they can be outside of that. Now, maybe they can. I'm not saying that they can't, but Craig is just sort of dogmatically asserting here that, no, it's not a physical principle. It doesn't have anything to do with space and time. But like it does. Under standard views, it absolutely does. So what's Craig's reasons for thinking that, in fact, it's a metaphysical principle? He's just begging the question by saying, yeah, but it's a physical principle. Sorry, but it's a metaphysical principle, Craig says. Well, even if it is a metaphysical principle, it could be a metaphysical principle that only applies, within a context of spatiotemporal events. So I regard that as just question begging.
Principle that being doesn't come from non-being, and that therefore nothing can come into existence from nothing. Something comes into being only from something else. There needs to be a cause of something coming in.
But that's just your contention, Craig. Why does something coming into being have to have a cause? Everyone that I've ever heard write about this agrees that something can't come into being from nothing. But that's just because that's confusing and misleading language. What some people think is that plausibly things can come into being without a cause. That's different to saying from nothing. Again, because I talked about the preposition and how that doesn't make sense to talk about from nothing. And Craig's reason as to why things can't come into being without a cause is that everything that comes into being must come into being from something else. But I mean, what's the argument? You're just reasserting your conclusion there. I don't see why we should think that. We've gone through the reasons that Craig gives about intuitions and induction, and seen how there's actually a parity case that Scott has made, or I also illustrated how that could work as well. And it's not clear why Craig's understanding of that should be preferred to an alternate argument, which relies on the same principles or methods. So at the end of the day, it seems that Craig is left with just asserting his contention repeatedly without actually having any substance for it.
Into being. So what folks like yourself have to do is to try to provide some reason for restricting the causal principle to this physical universe or within the physical.
No, that's see, shifting burden of proof again. Craig needs to provide a reason for applying it everywhere. The person who is skeptical and says, well, does it apply everywhere? They don't have to give a reason for why it should be constrained. That's a shifting of the burden of proof. The person who is making the assertion about the scope of some sort of quantifier in this case, or the essential properties of something, they are the ones who need to give reasons for that. Now, of course, the person who's skeptical can give countervailing reasons that should as effectively rebuttals, but you can't just assert that something applies everywhere and then say you have to show that it doesn't apply everywhere. That's blatantly shifting the burden of proof.
Universe, I mean, but deny its applicability to the universe as such.
Right.
It seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding.
So I think that when somebody objects to the causal principle by saying, this is something that applies to, things within the universe, the interaction of efficient and material causes within time and space, that what they're doing there is challenging the assumption that the scope of the causal principle is in fact metaphysical and not physical.
Right.
So to my ear, it does no good to respond to that objection by reasserting the very thing being questioned, which is that the scope of the causal principle.
Which is what I was saying. Question begging.
Question begging to me. So
there you go.
Why should we think that the scope of the causal principle is metaphysical? After all, we've only experienced things within the universe anyway.
Well, again, because it is stated as a metaphysical principle. It's not stated as a merely physical principle the way a law of nature is. So the person who wants to restrict the scope of the principle needs to provide some sort of justification, as I think you've tried to do with your argument about material causation. But I think that leaves us, as I say, with an absurd situation. So the principle is simply, I mean, historically, it's been part of metaphysics. It's not part of science. It's presupposed, I suppose, by science. But the principle of itself is part of and always has been part of metaphysics.
Well, you could rephrase what I'm saying.
That is such a stupid response. I'm sorry. That is such a bad response. First of all, just because something is like part of metaphysics doesn't mean that it can't apply only to space and time. Like Craig's view about the philosophy of time, that is a metaphysical view that's part of metaphysics, but it applies to time, like in the temporal, I don't know, order of events, and not to things outside of time. So the fact that the scope of a concept is restricted to, say, the universe or spatio-temporal events or whatever, doesn't mean that it's not a metaphysical principle. That is just a bizarre thing to say. But also, just because historically it was part of metaphysics, it doesn't mean anything. That's just where it was studied or categorized. That is also doubly irrelevant. And also, what Craig said about, it's just asserted as a metaphysical principle, is that it seems to be equivalent to Craig just saying, I'm just asserting that it applies everywhere. And therefore, but see, even that doesn't make any sense, because just because something's a metaphysical principle doesn't mean it has unconstrained scope, right? That would be like saying that my theory of space or my theory of time or my theory of like biology or my theory of gender or whatever other things you might debate about metaphysically somehow applies outside of the context where those are even relevant. Like it doesn't make sense. If the concept itself is constrained to applying to a particular set of things, it doesn't do any good to say, well, that's a metaphysical principle. That doesn't mean that it applies everywhere. It just means that it's studied in metaphysics. Like this is a bizarre argument
here in a way that's amenable to that, right? You could say, there's a lot of daylight between whatever begins to exist has a cause, and it being inexplicable why anything and everything doesn't just pop into being uncaused out of nothing, right?
Okay, so wait, that's the second argument, though, that we haven't gotten to yet.
That's true. But the only reason I mention that is because I want to say that there are plenty of alternatives here, right? It could be the case that the causal principle, as stated, is false. It could be true that there's a different causal principle is true instead, but this causal principle is false. For example, Graham Oppy has a causal principle he offers that all non-initial things that begin to exist have a cause. It could be true that whatever begins to exist has a cause within time and space. Whatever begins to exist within time and space has a cause. There are many possibilities for why the causal principle could be false that don't commit us to thinking that there's just chaos. You know what I mean?
There's a lot of plausible reasons why you might say all non-initial things require a cause. For example, you might think that causes cannot be causes must precede their effects, in which case, obviously, the very first thing cannot have a cause because nothing precedes it. I think that's absolutely defensible. Another view would be to advance the argument that I've made about causes being spatiotemporal events, in which case there simply has to be an initial one of them that because assuming there can't be infinite events that all sort of stack up at the first moment of time, which seems a bit bizarre, and that would commit you to an infinite sequence of events anyway. But outside of that, you just would run out of events, and so there must be a first one that doesn't have any anything causally antecedent to it. So those are just two things off the top of my head as to why you might say all non-initial causes have all non-initial events have a cause, or things that come into being have a cause. Whereas Craig scoffed at that and he's probably going to say, oh, that's just ad hoc. Well, no, it's not ad hoc, though, because there's reasons you can give for it, right? And again, this is just about appealing to different intuitions, doing different conceptual analysis, maybe doing the induction differently. Craig needs to show why his way of doing that is preferred to alternative ways. And when it comes up, he usually just scoffs or says it's just a basic metaphysical principle, or says that people have always agreed with me, with Craig, or he just says that well, you haven't like shown that your view is correct, so therefore mine must be. These are all obfuscation and avoiding the point and shifting the burden of proof.
I mean,
well, now I would agree with both of the principles that you just stated, that all non-initial things have a cause, or everything that begins within space and time has a cause. But the point is that those more restricted versions of the principle don't justify a denial of the broader principle that being cannot come from non-being.
Well, of course they do, if they're better evidenced, right?
I just can't. Well, I mean, you say you believe that, I guess, and that if that's what you believe, fine. But I could never. I'm more like David Hume. You know, I could never believe what to me seems so absurd is that things could come into being without being caught.
Well, Craig, I could never believe in a thing that's like David Hume. I could never believe in something so absurd as to think that, you know, an omnipotent God sent, you know, Jesus to this world to die for our sins, or, you know, and raised him from the dead on the third day, whatever I want to say. This is not philosophy, or I guess it's really bad philosophy, just by saying it's so absurd to me and then appealing to authority. Like, am I being unfair here? Craig is literally just saying that the views of his interlocutor are absurd and appealing to authority, as well as people have always thought this, to say that why we should accept it. Like, that is just such a crappy way of doing philosophy. He's not actually giving a conceptual analysis or trying to give reasons or appealing to science or like however else you might want to do it. I just think that this is appalling. Like, where's the truth seeking here? This is just, well, here's my intuition. Yeah, but I don't agree with that. Well, I mean, you can have that intuition if you want, but like David Hume, you know. And yeah, Craig is scoffing. Not a lot, but you absolutely saw it a few times there. And look, I scoff as well, so I don't want to put myself on a pedestal there, but the position's not really the same, is it? I'm not having a conversation with someone, I'm reviewing a video. So again, I'm not impressed here by the way Craig's approaching this. Well, I mean, not surprising. Obviously, I'm biased against Craig, but anyways.
Let me ask you a very, well, no, never mind. Okay, go ahead. You go ahead.
oh no,
Man, I was looking forward to that.
All right. I was saying, Scott, I mean, for me, this is a very personal issue, right? This is serious business. It's not just looking for an academic refutation of a proof. We're trying to get at reality and figure out the nature and meaning of the world. And so,
yeah, see, I don't believe Craig when he says that. I mean, I believe him when he says that this is more than an academic issue, right? But I don't believe Craig is honest when he says that we're trying to get at what's true or trying to find out how reality works or whatever he said exactly. Because I show in his book, he says that these arguments are not reason guiding for him. That is, he doesn't believe in God or Jesus or Christianity because of these sorts of considerations. That comes first and the arguments come second. The arguments are a way of bolstering faith. That doesn't mean he doesn't think the arguments are like good arguments. I don't mean that. I just mean that at very least it's disingenuous, I think, for Craig to phrase it in that way where it's like we're trying to figure out if God exists. Well, no, Craig's not doing that when he presents a Kalam. He's already decided God exists. He admits to this, right? He describes it himself. The Kalam is like icing on the cake. It's not how he or indeed he thinks how other people should come to believe primarily that God exists. So I think that that's disingenuous there for him to say that this is like important because we need to figure out whether God exists and how things fit together there.
oh, I wonder, would I be willing to stand before God on the judgment day and God were to say to me, why didn't you believe in me? And I would say, well, because I thought the universe might have popped into being uncaused out of nothing. I think God would look at me and say, you what? I'm just not prepared to do that sort of thing. Are you?
Right, but I reject that imagery, right? I don't think that's what, by denying the causal principle, I don't think that's what is entailed by it. That seems wrong to me, right? The idea that there was this, and perhaps you could unpack this, right? Because I don't really understand the reasoning behind this.
Oh, good. I'd love him to explain this.
I don't see how the universe did any coming from. If there's no such thing as anything earlier than the universe, and we also agree that there's nothingness is not like an actual circumstance that could obtain. Right. It's not an actual state of affairs. So whence cometh the universe, right? I mean, it seems to me that as long as you stipulate those two things, that there's no such thing as before the universe and there's no such thing as nothing, then what do you mean when you say that the universe came from nothing? There's no nothing to come from.
I've answered that. When I say from nothing, you mean not from anything.
Right.
That's
But
what
I
it
agree
means
with
when you
that.
say
Right.
it came not from anything. And I think that, well, the question is,
Come on, Craig. Saying that something comes from nothing is not the same thing that it doesn't come from anything. Colloquially, I suppose we may mix those, but they certainly sound different if you think about them. They're very different imagery, right? One is saying that it does come from something and that thing is nothing, and it evokes this image of a big poof, and then there's something that's there. And Craig actually encourages this when he talks about something about this is even worse than magic, because at least in magic you've got like a magician and who pulls a rabbit out of a hat or something like that. He's evoking this image of like a poofing or an appearance. Whereas to say that there was no thing that it came from is just to say that there isn't anything that it came from. Just like, Santa Claus, it doesn't exist. That's a very different type of claim. Even if colloquially, yeah, we might mix it up a bit, but certainly if we're trying to have a philosophical discussion, I think confusing coming from nothing with there being nothing from which it came is really a problematic, even in terms of clarity of language. At the very least, clarity of language. I think Craig just should stop using this, and because it's misleading. And many people, not just me, I quote. I don't remember exactly, but I quote people in my book who object to that language. Scott's objecting to that language. So I think pretty much everyone who is skeptical of the causal principle does not accept the language of the universe coming into being from nothing. They'll say, no, it just didn't have a cause, or there wasn't anything that it came from. So Craig, I think, should, absent a very good reason not to, which I don't think he offers, should accept that and just say, okay, yes, there was nothing that it came from, and should stop giving this misleading language here, which I think is just for a really rhetorical effect and is not really supposed to clarify the issue here.
is that metaphysically absurd to think that the universe came into being not from anything?
Well, but even came into being, like, I would phrase it differently, right? I would just say the universe didn't come from anything. Not that the universe came from not anything. I would say the universe didn't come.
Yeah.
It didn't do any coming. There was nothing.
Well,
coming is like a verb. You know what I mean? It creates
right.
an imagery.
It's
that
a
doesn't seem right.
tensed. It's a tensed verb, and the beginning of the universe, I think, is a tensed fact. Remember my analogy of the yardstick. It's not
Right,
just that the
yeah.
yardstick has a first inch, but that the yardstick came into being in the sense that it began to exist. So the verbal tense is important here.
Chas asks, at what point does the image of saying before God add helpfully to this discussion? Well, let me be cynical there and say it doesn't add anything to Scott or to me or other people who Scott's an atheist, right? He's an atheist advocate, or even agnostics or other people. I don't think it does much of anything to them. So you might ask, well, who is it? Who is that for? Like someone who isn't convinced that God exists isn't going to be persuaded by that. I don't think. I mean, maybe there's a few, but look, I think that's for the Christians in the audience who might be wavering, or people who are sort of on the fence. Because I think that sort of appeal might be appealing to them. They might think, well, I have these doubts, but would I really be willing to at least potentially stand before God and defend myself on the basis of these doubts? I mean, I don't even think that theologically that makes any sense. But like, I think that it's imagery that's evocative for a certain type of person. And that certain type of person is maybe someone who is a Christian or was a Christian or has doubts or something like that. I think that is why Craig says things like that. Yeah, such as the standing before God. And I think there was something else before that was sort of similar to that. Oh yeah, like his argument that life is meaningless without God. I think that's another example of that's supposed to appeal to people like that. Anyway, that's me being cynical. I don't have proof for that, but yeah, I agree that's kind of unhelpful. Now, this point about the tense theory of time, there's a whole lot to say about this, but I agree. I think with both of them here that talking about coming into being and popping and things like that is tense to language, and I think you could just as readily make that as an argument, make that into an argument. A reductio argument against the tense theory of time, that it implies that you have to have this sort of absolute becoming of the universe, which doesn't really make sense, right? If you just say that the universe has a finite extension in the before than direction, which is what you would say under an eternalist or a three-dimensional, I guess four-dimensional with all the spatial dimensions, a four-dimensional block theory of time, then you don't have this problem. There's no sort of coming into it all. There's no temporal becoming in the way Craig thinks of it. Now, Craig's going to say this is a feature, obviously, because he thinks temporal becoming is like real and objective, right? But I mean, I discuss this more in my book. I won't get into all the arguments for that now, but I don't accept that. And many philosophers don't accept that. And does the person that you're trying to convince of the causal principle have to accept that as well? Because we've already got that they're supposed to accept agent causation, and now they're also supposed to accept a tense theory of time, in addition to this fundamental principle of everything needing to, have a cause. it turns out that there's quite a lot that you actually have to accept to get this causal principle off the ground. That the one that seems to be just so obvious and fundamental. And this is the point that I've been making. It's actually a lot of stuff that Craig needs to get working
on a tense theory of time, which I've gone to great efforts to defend.
Yeah, I
yes,
discussed that
and
in my
I
book.
concede that that's not something I'm prepared to disagree with you about. You are the world's probably foremost expert on the difference between A and B theory of time and the arguments between them. All I can say is that intuitively, B theory seems more right to me.
Okay, well, that's
but I also don't I don't want to, and I don't believe I am hinging my objection to the Kalam cosmological argument, or the causal premise in this case, on B theory. I wouldn't want to make that mistake.
Well, so far in our discussion,
which is funny because Craig, by his own admission, I quote this in my book, that argues that the Kalam is contingent or hinged on the tense theory of time, that is presentism. He said just here that he's gone at great lengths to defend that. That's true. He wrote 4 very long, very boring books on this issue, and I go through the arguments I think presented in 3 of them. One is more theological, I didn't look at, but I don't think his argument's very good, but they're certainly worth taking seriously. He presents a lot of arguments from the literature, so a lot of it's not necessarily that original to him, although there are some points that they're original. For example, I really want someone to ask Craig, what is the temporal extent of the present, and listen to him give his answer to that, because it is the most silly thing that you've ever heard. Well, maybe not, but it's pretty darn silly. And I've never heard him talk about it in a debate or a public forum. So that would be interesting. I mean, he talks about people believing in absurd things, but he believes that what is present depends on what you talk about or something like that. So, pot calling the kettle black. Or
if I were to summarize your position, it seems to me that your misgivings are that necessarily every efficient cause is accompanied by a material cause. And since that isn't the case at the beginning of the universe, therefore, the universe began to exist without a cause, and you're willing to simply bite the bullet and affirm that metaphysical fact.
Right. And again, this goes back to your heuristic about intellectual price tags, right? Because
that's right.
To my ear, what accepting the conclusion of the Kalam cosmological argument commits us to is a lot. We have to accept that there are unembodied minds, that there are timeless persons. We have to accept that an effect can be produced without anything having been affected anywhere at all. We have to accept, we have to sacrifice a lot of features of causality as we understand it. So if all these things are true, I don't want
to disagree with that. You don't have to sacrifice a lot of features of causality.
Why did Craig interrupt there? Now, I know he doesn't. Scott said to interrupt him, I think if he was mischaracterizing him, but this is not a mischaracterization. This is Scott's opinion, right? He's giving his argument. Craig shouldn't have interrupted him there. He should have let him finish his point and then made a counter. Of course, he doesn't have to agree with that. Craig's not. This is what I said before. Craig is not going to just let it lie at a clash of intuitions. Although he did say that there is one of those. But he's going to say, no, you don't have to sacrifice all these things. But you do, right? Because I think Scott's exactly on the money here. You do have to believe in immaterial minds. You do have to believe that there can be substance causes. You do have to believe that there are causes outside of space and time. You do have to believe that there can be causes without material causes, or at least outside of sort of space and time. And I think that these are a lot of things that we sort of take as well, some of those are things we take as obvious. Other things of those are controversial, as whether they're immaterial minds. So I think that there is a big price tag to pay, and that's actually why a lot of philosophers wouldn't agree with Craig in terms of all of the steps he goes down here, because there seems to be a very big price tag to pay there. So I think that's a very reasonable point. Let's see where Craig differs.
Causality. You would just say that some common features of causality are not necessarily essential to causality.
Oh, come on! How do you know they're not essential?
You mentioned are quite right. That's right. So I think for our listeners, they have to assess, where does the higher price tag lie?
Right. And so and conversely, I think the only...
Yeah, I think that almost proves a strong word. But look, obviously, if he was trying to appeal to someone who doesn't believe that God exists, or that minds are immaterial, or that you can have substance causes, standard sort of materialist or naturalist type of view, they're going to find this completely unpersuasive, because they're just not going to agree with a whole bunch of things that Craig's put forward, just like I don't, right? And he's not even trying to defend these, not even a bit. He's just saying, well, yeah, sure, you have to accept these things, but I mean, you just have to decide what you think is more reasonable. So I think that, I mean, I guess there's different arguments you could make there, but there's different interpretations you could give there, but it does seem to me that he is interested in appealing to people who already are on board or close to being on board, leaning towards a whole bunch of those sorts of views. So I think that, I just think this is interesting sort of rhetorically, or in terms of the level of discourse, in terms of who is this supposed to be convincing to? Who should be persuaded by Craig's argument here? Because it seems obvious to me that it can't be everyone, right? Because there are so many things he's just saying, well, yeah, if you don't believe in that, if you don't believe in this other thing, if you don't believe in tensed time, if you don't believe that there can be immaterial minds, if you reject the causal principle, if you think that causes are things that happen, in material space and time. If you're these sorts of people, then Craig's like, well, you're not going to come along with me here. But if you assess it the way Craig does, then you'll agree with me. And I think that he's presenting that basically to the Christians, or the sort of lapsed Christians or interested Christians there. Yeah, David says here, listeners should probably not hinge in big important beliefs on speculative philosophy. I would agree with that, which is one of the reasons I think the Kalam is a bad argument, because there's so many steps there that are quite very speculative and dubious and controversial, and you need all of them to work. And Craig's just sort of hoping to carry you along with that. He doesn't seem very interested in persuading you of giving reasons, at least not here. I mean, I suppose you could say he's written elsewhere, but even in his other debates, I think a lot of the time he just sort of tries to appeal to things that people will find intuitive, like that you can't pop into being from non-being, or that, immaterial minds can be causes, or that causes can be outside of space and time is tensed and things like this. He just sort of hopes you'll go along with his intuitions, it seems.
Bullet that I'm really biting is that things beginning to exist having causes is a common feature, an extremely common feature, but it can't possibly apply to everything, right? It couldn't apply to the universe itself for some of the reasons that I've given. That, to me, that doesn't seem like a huge bullet to bite, especially given how ill-equipped we are in terms of our intuitions about how the world really works.
Well, I think that the big bullet that you bite, Scott, is that as a result of your argument, you're stuck with the universe coming into existence without explanation, for no reason at all, without a cause. It's the view that my friend Quentin Smith used to say: the universe came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. Sort of a nice Gettysburg Address of atheism. Well, that doesn't seem to me the bullet you're going to bite, given your principle that every efficient cause must have a material cause as an accompaniment. And I would rather let that go by the board than give up the idea that the universe beginning had to have some sort of explanation.
Yeah, it seems to me sometimes it's.
I'm annoyed here that Craig is conflating explanation with cause. It's not clear that they're the same thing. There is a causal theory of explanations, which would say that an explanation is just presenting a cause. But actually, if that's true, then appealing to explanation doesn't really add anything. It's basically saying the same thing. Craig loves this phrase, Gettysburg Address of atheism. He uses it very frequently in his writing and in debates. I've heard it so many times. So this is why I can't listen too much to Craig, right? Because I just hear the same thing and it just irritates me. But anyway, there are a few new things in this discussion here, so that's been good. But so there's a point about explanations. What is Craig's explanation for why the universe began? Now, he's going to say, well, God created it. Well, yeah, but that seems a bit ad hoc to me, because even if we accept that God exists, it's not clear that he would want to create anything or would have reasons to. So I think that I'm going to ask for a bit more than just say God created it. Like, did he have a reason for creating it? And if so, what is that reason, right? And I think that you actually get into problems there, because it seems that God can't have a reason outside of himself for creating the universe. But then if it's inside himself and God's nature is necessary, then God didn't have a choice about creating the universe, and so it wasn't freely chosen. So it seems that the choice that God created the universe wasn't based on any reason at all. It was just arbitrary. He just sort of decided to do it for no reason, right? And if that's true, then the universe doesn't actually have a purpose in the way that Craig, I think, would say. I know that he wouldn't agree with this, right? But if you think about the idea that, it could have a purpose, right? But it wouldn't have a reason, I should say. It wouldn't have a reason in the way that Craig wants to say, because like, again, if God had a reason for creating the universe, that reason can't have been outside God, because God's self-sufficient. I don't see how it could have been inside God, like part of his nature, because then it would have been necessary that God would create the universe, and God didn't have free choice. But I think that Craig denies that. His account of agent causation explicitly denies that it's a free choice of an agent. So that's out. So all that's left with is that God didn't have a reason for creating the universe, and he just sort of did it, for no reason. Like, he just decided to do it. So there's a problem even under that view about whether the universe had a reason. Then we can ask about explanations. Well, what is the explanation of why God created the universe? It doesn't seem to be one. I mean, I've heard a few things that are said about this. I don't find them very persuasive, and I think they run into other problems. So maybe Craig can come up with something, right? But it's not obvious that he has an explanation for the universe either, other than just saying God did it. And I don't know why we should think that the universe would have an explanation. Again, that's a separate principle that he's appealing to. The notion, this is basically the appeal to the principle of sufficient reason, right? Every contingent fact must have an explanation or something to that effect. Why should we accept that? It's much along the lines of his appeal to the causal principle, that everything that begins to exist has a cause. He's saying everything that, say, begins to exist, or everything that's contingent has to have an explanation. Well, why think that, right? He is presenting it as if there's a huge price tag here to say that the universe came into being without a cause and without an explanation and without a reason. Now, as I said, it's not clear that you even have an explanation or a reason under Craig's view. I grant, have a cause, although he only gets to a cause by defining cause in a very idiosyncratic way. So I don't actually see that that's a lower price tag. But even that aside, even if Craig can solve those problems, why think that we need those things? Why is it a bad thing not to have a cause or an explanation or a reason for something? Unless you establish that we should expect that, then it's not a price tag at all. Again, it's just back to his intuition. Craig thinks there should be a reason and a cause and an explanation, so he's going to say it's a price tag to not have them. Scott's going to say, I don't see why we should expect the beginning of the universe to have any of those things, and so it's not a price tag. At that point, it's a clash of intuitions, and why should we prefer Craig's view to anyone else's? I don't think that Craig has really offered reason to accept that, to prefer his view, other than that sort of he asserts it, and he's given an argument from authority. I guess that's the other thing that he said. That's just bad philosophy. Like, we should be trying to offer reasons that, at least in principle, are going to be persuasive, or could be persuasive, to people that don't hold our view. And just saying, well, it seems obvious to me, or other people have said this before, or it's just a foundational principle, are not those sorts of reasons, right? Craig says this is serious. He said that, we're trying to get to the truth here. We're trying to figure this out. But then he doesn't actually approach it in a way that seems consistent with that, degree of seriousness or importance. He just, like, where is the actual careful reasoning, the conceptual analysis that maybe this appeals to science, or the appeals to other aspects of metaphysics that you then combine together? There's many ways you can approach this, but simply quoting Hume and asserting your intuitions, and then using misleading language like popping into being from nothing, that's just not a good way to do it.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
We've only got about 10 minutes left, and I was thinking that it might be fun to turn to the second argument that Dr. Craig normally gives.
I would like to do that
for about 10 minutes.
It is a follow-up argument, Scott, to the first one we've been talking about. Suppose you're willing, with Scott, to bite the bullet and say things can come into being without
I don't see that there's any bullet to bite. But
or things can begin to exist without a cause, to put it more neutrally. Then, as Arthur Pryor pointed out, you face this very difficult question. Why is it only universes that come into being without causes? Why can't Beethoven or bicycles or root beer or anything just come into being or begin to exist without a cause? Once you allow an exception to the principle that everything that begins to exist has a cause, then there's no answer, it seems to me, to that.
This is such
question.
a dumb
And yet,
argument.
obviously, things aren't popping into being uncaused all the time around us.
I quote in I respond to this in my book, and I don't remember who the philosopher is. Maybe it was Quentin Smith or one of the others. People have responded to this years ago, and Craig just doesn't seem to have acknowledged that anyone's responded to this. Like, it's such a stupid argument, because the person who is saying that the universe may not have had a cause is giving, like Scott, like myself, like others, is giving a principled argument that, look, universes aren't the sort of things that can have causes, because they exist out, like, the beginning of the universe is the coming into being of, under Craig's view at least, of all of space and time. And so that's one thing. That's a different type of thing to things happening within the universe, within space and time. This is a fairly basic point. Things that happen within space and time are very different to the coming into being of space and time per se. It's perfectly reasonable to say that the coming into being of space and time is very different to things happening inside of space and time. So obviously things that exist inside of space and time, like Beethoven bicycles and root beer, are sorts of things that need causes. In fact, we know that all of those things require causes, but it's actually plausible that all things within space and time have causes. There are, dare I say, a category error to compare these two. I don't think we need to use that phrase, but like, you could if it was helpful. But they're just very different things metaphysically. All of space and time versus particular things within space and time. The claim is that all of space and time is not the sort of thing that needs a cause, whereas anything plausibly within space and time does need a cause. I'm not saying that Scott is committed to that, but that's at least a very plausible objection that could be given, and that I've given, that others have given in the past. Craig may have a counter, of course, but the point is he just doesn't address this. I've never seen him address this point, even though others have written about this. I've written about this before. It's very frustrating, because it seems like there's a very clear objection, and it's just like, no, Craig can't see any reason as to how there's any difference between all of space and time and root beer and bicycles. Somehow those are just like the same thing to him.
Yeah. I have two thoughts about that. One is that it seems to me that we can make a kind of parity argument on the other side of that. Like, your defense of the Kalam cosmological argument entails that it's not impossible for events to occur uncaused, right? And so now to me, that really runs afoul of my intuitions, right? That events, events can just happen spontaneously uncaused. And so I would ask the same kind of question. I would say, well, if it's possible for one event to occur uncaused, it becomes inexplicable why anything and anything doesn't just occur. Like, why isn't my pen just floating up in the air and spontaneously combusting? Why aren't windows breaking uncaused all the time?
Now, let me interrupt at this point, Scott, and say that
Sure.
while the causal premise is formulated in terms of substances rather than events, that everything that begins to exist has a cause, it doesn't deny that every event has a cause. It just says I'm not committed to that. The argument doesn't commit me to that. If I were to deny that every event has a cause, it would probably be for reasons of libertarian freedom, namely that I'm not a determinist. And so I think that personal agents can freely bring about causes without being determined to do so. But that's a quite different debate with respect to libertarian freedom.
This is unbelievable. I mean, people who adhere to libertarian freedom usually want to say that the agent is the cause of anything that they will, right? So I don't know that would actually be a counter, although it depends how you analyze it. But aside from that, you see what Craig's doing here. He's going to say, well, actually, maybe I would deny that all events have a cause. But if I did so, it's because I have this other beliefs, right? And so I've got my reasons for that. And we can just push those over to the side. Just don't look at those. Don't worry about that. I've got my reasons for that. Let's just talk about this here. But of course, when it comes to the interlocutor like Scott, who is arguing that, well, maybe actually the universe didn't need a cause, Craig is not going to grant them the same sort of liberty. He's not going to allow them to just say, well, maybe actually I have a reason for saying that universes can't have causes, and because that's a particular view that I have because of the nature of causes, I'm just going to put that to the side here. Don't worry about that. I've got my reasons for it. No, he's not going to allow them to do it. He's going to say, oh, that's arbitrary, and why that, and why can't everything just pop into being, and blah, 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 right? But you could just levy the exact same, you could levy everything that Craig has objected to Scott against Craig right now if he's going to admit the possibility of events beginning uncaused. Could you say, well, why can't everything begin uncaused? And Craig would say, oh, well, no, not everything, because it's libertarian agents. But that's just a way of him saying that he thinks, plausibly at least, there are types of events that can happen without causes. He thinks he has an account to give of that, but so what? Scott thinks he has an account to give as well. Why is Craig allowed to just sort of push his account to the side and say, oh, this is a completely different question, when it's not a completely different question? It's just a different aspect of the issue of what is the nature of causation, and what are the relata of causation, what are the necessary conditions, and all of that stuff. This is absolute special pleading at its finest, I think, that Craig is allowed to at least acknowledge the possibility that he might endorse causeless events, whilst calling out Scott for endorsing this ridiculous principle that's a foundation of Western philosophy, that everything that begins to exist has a cause. I think that this is just, yeah, you get the idea.
The Kalam argument is just neutral as to whether every event has a cause. So there's no parity available there.
Well, right, but the lesson, as I take it here, is that, well, here you have an example of something, in this case, events, if you allow for mental events, right, and yet clearly you agree that just because mental events, like in the context of libertarian free will, can occur without a cause, it's not inexplicable why other events, like my pen floating in the air.
Again, I don't know that that's true. I feel like that, the notion of agent causation, at least, I guess there are different notions of libertarian free will. So some versions of libertarian free will, I think, would say that the mental events could be causeless, but agent causation, as I understand it, says that the agent as a substance is the cause of events. Like if I decide to, I don't know, pick up my book, right? I, as an agent, an immaterial substance of some sort, are exerting a cause that on, I guess, my muscles, which then is like muscle fibers firing is an event then, or a series of events then, which leads to me picking up the book, something like that, right? And in that case, the substance is actually the cause of the effect, which is an event. So this is a notion of substance event causation, which is, as I said, highly controversial, because typically it's thought that events are the relata of causation, not substances and events. And if you want to acknowledge that substances can be causes, then it actually seems unclear as to why only agents can be causes. Like why can't all substances, like electrons or books or trees or planets or whatever, be causes of things? Not as events, not because the billiard ball hits another billiard ball. That would be an event. I mean, the billiard ball as a substance, like as a thing, causes another thing. That's a different notion than event causation. And so this, I think, gets you into really problematic territory where you have to say, well, look, agents are a special type of thing that have a special type of creative power that other things don't have. And then, I mean, you can argue that, right? You can argue for anything, but the point is Craig wants to present his view as obvious and not requiring any particular controversial commitments, but it just obviously does, right? If you actually unpack it, in appealing to agent causation, he actually does have a whole bunch of stuff like that like that there is this special type of causation that happens between substances and events, or if that's not true, then events can happen without a cause, or however he wants to frame it. Libertarian agency is really problematic, I think, for these sorts of reasons. But again, Craig just won't admit to that. He just will say, no, I can believe that, and that's a different thing. Oops.
Can happen without a cause, right? So clearly it doesn't follow that just if it's the case that the universe is uncaused, then we would expect to see objects within the universe popping into existence uncaused all the time.
Well, now, libertarians would typically affirm agent causation with respect to acts of free will. It's not as though acts of free will just happen randomly. There is an agent there who can freely choose to do this or that. But in the case of the universe beginning to exist, see, there's nothing prior to it. On atheism, there's nothing there. So if that can happen without a cause, anything should be able to happen without a cause, because there's nothing to restrict it.
Yeah, so that's sort of what I was said. The agent causation says that the agent itself is a cause, which entails substance event causation, which I think is problematic. And it, I think, actually does mean that you get a huge number of unexplained events. So what is the explanation for why a libertarian agent chooses A rather than B? It seems that there cannot be an explanation, because there's just no fact of the matter in virtue of which, like, the one is chosen or the other. It's just, well, that's what they just chose. So I actually think that gets you to a really non-parsimonious ontology. You have this massive laundry list of all of these brute facts that just sort of happen without any explanation. So if Craig is worried about things that don't have explanations, I think libertarian agency is not where you want to go. As well as the fact that the causal analysis there of substance event causation is really problematic as well. But again, Craig doesn't want to address any of those, and he thinks that that's fine, and he doesn't sort of have any, he's not biting any bullets by endorsing that, but of course Scott is, when he's, you know, skeptical about the causal premise. But I also want to say, again, Craig, it's like he just refuses to see the idea. He refuses to see the claim being that causes and effects are things that happen within space and time. They're part of that causal order, right? You can imagine drawing a box around it, or a circle around it. That's the causal order, right? Within space and time. Causation applies here. If there is anything outside of that, which of course the materialist doesn't believe there is anything outside that, but if there is something outside of that, it couldn't be in causal relation to anything inside that, because that's just not how it works, right? It's like saying, well, there's a sausage outside the universe. Sausages just aren't the sort of things that can be outside of space and time, right? It doesn't make sense. In fact, isn't there a recent Marvel movie, or maybe it was a TV series or something, where like all of space and time is like destroyed, but then they go somewhere that's outside of space and time, but they're like moving around and talking to each other and touching things, and like it doesn't really make any sense. It's like space and time outside of space and time. But the point is that that's the analysis that's being given. Causation is something that exists in space and time. And Craig is saying, yeah, but why couldn't there be a cause outside of space and time? Like, what's different about outside of space and time, when the whole claim is that space and time is the place where causes are? They live here. They live in the space and time thing. They live, which would be the universe, according to Craig. They live in space time. They live in the universe. They don't do stuff outside the universe, because they're not that sort of thing. But somehow Craig just can't comprehend that. I actually think he can comprehend that. He just sort of refuses to, rhetorically, because it's like that's the claim, right? You can disagree that that's a good argument, or that there are counters, but at least you have to recognize that is what is being claimed. Causes are things that live in the universe. They don't happen outside the universe, and they can't relate the universe to anything outside of the universe, because that's the analysis that's being given of causation. If Craig can have his brute metaphysical principles, then heck, we'll just say that that's a brute metaphysical principle. Now, I don't think you have to. I think you can give reasons for it, but even if you don't want to, just say, yeah, that's our brute principle, and then we're done. Like, there's no problems anymore, because we're just appealing to a different principle to Craig is. He hasn't shown us a reason for preferring his over alternatives.
Yeah, see, I think of it the opposite way, right? I think, okay, if there were time before the universe, you've got like nothing happening, and then pop, universe. That I would completely deny that that's possible, right? But we're not talking about a circumstance like that. We're just talking about the universe just being there at all temporal points, right? And again, I know that goes into A theory and B theory, and I'm not prepared
it does, because the Kalam argument is not committed as such to saying that time began at the creation of the first event. People like Alan Paget and Richard Swinburne, John Lucas, and others have discussed the idea that there could be a kind of non-metric time prior to the moment of creation. So I try to...
Good luck trying to make sense of non-metric time. Actually, that notion of a non-metric time is critical to Craig's analysis of time, because he defines the present as a non-metricable interval of time, which varies in length depending on what you refer to. So, but I mean, I think that that's just a whole lot of nonsense. That doesn't make any sense at all. But when Craig wants to appeal to strange ideas like non-metric time, he can just do that. And apparently there's no price to pay. But then when Scott wants to say, I'm not sure that the universe had a cause, oh, the sky's falling in and we're violating foundational metaphysical principles.
Open alternatives to people rather than close them off. And I'm open to the idea that there was time prior to the creation of the physical universe. I don't think there was, but I'm not prepared to say that that's impossible.
Well,
and in that case, you need to ask
agree.
yourself, how do you, yeah, I mean, if you think that, suppose you think there was time prior to the beginning of the universe.
Yeah,
then,
I would certainly agree.
In that case, you ought to say that the universe began, that the universe had a cause.
Yeah, yeah.
So Scott, I mean, wait a minute. Now look what you've just done. I mean, I think you've backed yourself into theism here, because on the view that time precedes the beginning of the universe, you admit that the beginning of the universe would require a transcendent cause. And that's exactly what people like Richard Swinburne, John Lucas, Alan Paget, and others believe. So I think that you should become a theist.
Yeah, no, it's true. I don't find that objectionable, but I think we don't have time to go into it, but I think there are implications of that are obviously problematic. One question I wanted to ask you for clarification.
Yeah, that's really low. Scott's not doing anything of the sort, and Craig's just doing that for rhetorical effect, right? With 5 minutes left, and I very much doubt that they're not aware of the time that's left, right? He's saying, oh, you should become a theist because you backed yourself into a corner. I don't even see the logic that Craig's trying to appeal to there. If there is time prior to the universe, then that means that the universe is not being defined as all of space and time, which is one common definition that's used in these arguments. Now, Craig, I think, used a slightly different one, so I don't want to say that that's the one that he used. The thing is, though, that you need to be clear what we're talking about by universe. If by universe we mean like space and time, then there can't be time before the universe, right? That's just not, doesn't make sense. But you may define the universe differently. You may say the universe is actually all of matter and energy. And in that case, well, maybe you could have time before the universe. And actually, Craig in one of his books discusses an example of that, where it's like God could create time just in his mind by counting like 1, 2, 3, and then creating the universe. So that would be one possibility of how you could have time without actually any matter and energy. But of course, Scott's not going to agree that time could exist in that way. Perhaps there are other ways that time could exist that wouldn't require either God or the existence of matter and energy, although it's not really clear what that would look like. So Craig merely saying that Craig thinks that the universe, that there could have been time before the universe, and Scott then saying, well, if there was time before the universe, then the universe sort of could have had a cause or would have had a cause. I don't see what follows from that, because that's a conditional saying, well, if there was time before the universe, then the universe could have had a cause or would have had a cause. I'm not sure which it is here. But Scott doesn't think there was time before the universe. And maybe the only way to have time before the universe would be for God to exist, which Scott also doesn't believe, right? So I don't see how this forces Scott into any position at all. All he says is, if there was time before the universe, then these things would follow. But I mean, he doesn't think there was time before the universe. I don't, and maybe that's only possible if God exists, or if something like that happens. So, or like if there's some sort of supernatural being, which we don't believe in. Craig didn't establish here that there was time before the universe. That could have been a problem for Scott. Maybe if he could show that there was time before the universe, and Scott's view entailed that there couldn't be, that would be an objection. But like, what was the gotcha supposed to be? The gotcha was supposed to be that somehow, because there might have been time before the universe, like hypothetically, that would imply something that's contrary to Scott's argument. Therefore, it actually does imply something contrary to Scott's argument. That's sort of like saying, if God exists, then Scott's wrong. Well, so you've backed yourself into a corner, Scott. You should believe in God. Well, no. All that's established is that if certain things pertain, then Scott's argument wouldn't work or would have to be reformulated. But he didn't commit himself to those things pertaining. So I don't even understand what the gotcha was supposed to be. It just seemed to me entirely manufactured as a rhetorical point. Peter also mentions Peter, it looked like an L in the chat here. Peter also mentions, where does the option of deism disappear to, which I think is a good point as well. Deism often sort of disappears in these discussions as an option, as well as other potential non-material, non-physical causes of the universe, which I discuss in my book. I won't get into now, but there are quite a few possible candidates on the table there that people like Craig like to ignore. Now we're almost done here, so and I need to go. So let's try to finish up.
Is when you make this argument that it becomes inexplicable, are you making a would kind of argument or a could kind of argument? Are you saying that if the universe is uncaused, then we would see things popping into being within the universe, or that it's possible?
Well, I think I'm saying would, that if the universe can come into being, begin to exist without any cause at all, then it's inexplicable why anything and everything wouldn't pop into being without a cause. Because there's nothing to constrain it. You see, there's nothing to constrain coming into being, because there is no universe prior to the universe to make it the case that only universes can pop into being uncaused out of nothing.
Well, okay, so
what type of metaphysical views do you have to think that things need constraints in order to prevent them from coming into being? That's just so weird. It's like that they were trying to come into being, but the fact that they needed a cause prevented them, and therefore, if they don't need a cause, then they just will. Like that's just not. Why would you think that? I would say that many things won't come into being absent the necessary causes. There are certain things that don't require causes, and perhaps the universe is the only such thing because it's all of space and time, right? And that's a very different thing to things inside of space and time. I don't understand how any professional philosopher can at least fail to see the point here. They may disagree with the point, but Craig just seems to deliberately almost not see the point that's being made, that the set of all space and time is fundamentally not the same as things inside space and time. This is just the fallacy of composition, right? To say that well, actually, it's the opposite of that. It's saying that Craig is saying that there can't be any difference between the collection of all caused things and any particular caused thing. Now, of course, it would be the fallacy of I forgot the fallacy of composition, the fallacy of the reverse one of that, but to just assert that, well, they have to be different, right? They don't have to be different, but the question is, can they be different? And absolutely they can be, and not for arbitrary reasons, right? And anyway, it seems like Craig just doesn't want to understand that point there, and so he resorts to saying very bizarre things like, well, bicycles and Beethoven would be trying to come into existence, but if no cause prevented them from not coming into existence, then they just would. Well, no, they wouldn't come into existence unless the necessary causes are in effect. It's just that there aren't any necessary causes for all of space and time because it doesn't exist in the causal network. It's like it's a different thing.
So I do want to say to say that something is inexplicable. I mean, that you're not just saying, you're not just asking me what's the explanation. You're making a very ambitious claim here, which is that an explanation is impossible. I think that shifts the burden back onto you to show that such an explanation is literally impossible. Now, here's an analogy, right? Say I push the button.
Okay, I thought I did that. By my
sorry.
argument that there is nothing prior to the existence of the thing to constrain what sort of thing can come into being without a cause.
Yes, so let me answer that. Yes.
Yeah, okay.
That doesn't make any sense. It's not trying to come into being, but
prevented.
prevented.
The elevator is at maximum capacity. There's 15 people in there, and I can't get on the elevator. Now, let's say the elevator is analogous to the universe, right? The explanation of why I'm not getting onto the elevator is about facts in the elevator, right? It's facts that have to do with what's already in the elevator, not facts about what's outside the elevator. It's not a perfect analogy, but outside the elevator would be the nothingness. So that this argument that nothingness it's not discriminatory, it has no potential. I don't think it's the nothingness part, it's the nothingness side that's stopping something from coming into being. It's the something that's stopping something from coming into
the problem is, Scott, you've got to have something that it's explanatorily prior to the packed elevator. You can't use the packed elevator to explain it because that's already there. You need something that is explanatorily prior to the thing that begins to exist. And there isn't any such thing on an atheistic view.
Well, that's just a different question, though. We can ask the question, why are there all these people? Why is there an elevator and why are there so many people in the elevator? But the question that you were asking, well, the claim that you were making is that it's impossible to explain why things don't pop into being uncaused all the time within the universe. And I'm saying it's hardly impossible to explain that. Here are all these alternatives. It could be that the causal principle as phrased is false and some other causal principle is true instead. It could be the Graham-Oppy's causal principle.
No, wait, no, that wouldn't work. That's the genius of this second argument. The second argument is willing to allow you that things can pop into being uncaused out of nothing. But it demands, if that is possible, then why doesn't just anything and everything pop into being uncaused? That's Arthur Pryor's argument. And I think it's such a powerful second step because, as I say, it allows you to say things can come into being uncaused out of nothing, but then it asks why that isn't the case for everything. And the reason an explanation is impossible is because there isn't anything explanatorily prior to those things that would restrict what can come into being.
Why do you need an explanation of why things don't exist? That's just so strange. It's like there's nothing, or nothing exists, right? And we need an explanation as to why things don't exist. That's what Craig is actually saying, that we need to write an explanation for why things don't exist. And his profit explanation is that they need a cause to exist. But that just seems obviously wrong. It's completely the reverse as to what I would say. You don't need an explanation as to why things don't exist. You need an explanation as to why they do exist. And the explanation for certain things will be that the necessary and sufficient causes were present. Absent the necessary and sufficient causes, then they won't exist. Now, obviously, that's only going to be relevant in the case where causes operate, which, as Scott was saying, I don't quite like the analogy there, but I guess it kind of works. Inside the elevator, if you're inside the elevator, you don't ask why isn't this person in the elevator. You ask why is this person in the elevator, and the answer will be because the necessary and sufficient causes were in existence such that they came into to be in the elevator at a particular time. If I were to tell you that you needed a reason for why all of these people who weren't in the elevator, and your explanation was that the causes weren't operative that would have brought them there, that would just be bizarre and strange. Like, well, I mean, I guess, but you don't need to present that. You just say that. Nothing needs to be explained. The non-existence of things in general doesn't need to be explained unless there's a particular reason you would have expected them to be there. But it's like Craig wants us to field an explanation as to why beer doesn't pop into existence. With no explanation is needed. You only need to explain things that do exist, I think. And that would be explaining why we do see things that we do. And for that, you just need to provide the necessary and sufficient causes. Now, it's plausible that outside of the universe, according to this claim, there are no necessary and sufficient causes because causes don't exist outside the elevator, to use Scott's terminology. And so Craig's question as to why does the universe exist or not exist, I mean, plausibly just doesn't have an answer. There's maybe no reason for it. I don't think that there's a better reason under theism, which I mentioned before, but putting that to the side, it's not clear that there should be a reason. And so I just don't understand how we cannot see a difference between things inside the universe, which operate within the causal order, and the causal order itself. The causal order itself, it doesn't make sense to say that it has a cause because it itself is not within the causal order. Or at least plausibly. I suppose you could say that the set of all things that are caused itself is inside its own set. That would feel a bit weird to me, but I suppose you could go down that argument. You could go down that line, but I don't know why you would need to. Like, what would force you to that? And I don't think Craig's argument does just any good. I think it's just clear why Beethoven and root beer and whatever it is don't just pop into being, and it's not because that there's that they're sort of trying to, but they're sort of stopped by not having causes. It's rather the opposite. It's that they'll only come into being if they have the right causes in place. A very, very strange argument. I've never understood the appeal of that. Anyway, we're just about done, so let's wrap up, and I need to get going.
I hate to do this. We are at the hour mark, and that is the time that we could give to Dr. Craig. I appreciate both of you guys for coming on. Dr. Craig, is there anything that you'd like to say as we sort of
Yes, I would like to say that it is wonderful to chat with someone who has thought so seriously and thoroughly about these considerations. I lie awake at night thinking about these things, and I'll bet Scott does too. So thank you, Scott, for this engaging discussion today.
I can't tell you how much that means to me. I have so enjoyed this conversation. And again, I thank you for your time and your generosity and your charity. And this has been great.
I've really enjoyed just been like, this has been me the whole time. Just sitting back listening to the conversation.
You're a great interviewer, Cameron.
That's what you got to do, right? A lot of these guys want to jump in too much. Well, yeah, thank you guys both for coming on. It's been super, super awesome. Again, I was just sitting back listening to the dialogue. I loved it. It was great. But until the next video, I will see you guys later. Thanks again for joining me, and see you later.
All right.
Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're
It was only 1 hour. If you want long videos, check out Bad Apologetics on Digital Gnosis' channel. Those are some long videos.
Still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available.
Okay, so that really upset me. Not that he's spruiking his other videos. It's that the first one he puts up is of his exorcism video, which is one of the worst ones I've seen on his channel. I mean, even when I disagree with Craig or whoever, at least, the discussion that we just watched, it was good discussion, interesting points raised up. But that exorcism video is just so bad. I think I don't need to go over the points here. The only reason he spruiks it, in my opinion, is because it's his most popular video. It's got over 1 million views. That was a really disappointing addition there. Like, it doesn't even have anything to do with the topic matter. Anyway, so that put a bad taste in my mouth. But let's summarize. So let's see. Yes. What do I think about the debate overall? I mean, it was a good discussion overall. It was a good discussion. Some important points were raised, and it was good to explore this relatively underappreciated aspect of the Kalam argument. I think it was disappointing that Craig, I think for the most part, didn't engage seriously with the objections. One of the main objections that Scott raised is that causation plausibly is just a thing that exists within the universe. I mean, maybe that's a little bit more of how I phrase it than how he phrased it, but I felt like he was gesturing at that in different ways. And Craig just kind of didn't want to address that as a serious objection. He just said, well, my intuitions say that that's not the case, and tried to shift the burden back onto Scott to say, like, why does it only apply to the universe, rather than actually presenting with himself presenting reasons as to why it applies everywhere. Craig also appealed to authority, talked about it being a foundational principle of philosophy, quoted Hume, and used misleading language like popping into being and coming into being from nothing, which Scott took issue with, and I'm glad he did. I don't think there's really much substance there. It's an appeal to intuitions, it's appeal to authority, and it's a misleading use of language. And the other thing was an inductive argument, inducting over all of the things that we observe having causes, even though Scott presented alternative versions of the inductive argument, which Craig rejected, I think, without really much argument, trying to shift the burden onto Scott to say Scott's version was preferred, and not really addressing why we should prefer Craig's version. He also tried to downplay how risky and controversial and problematic a lot of his positions are, including tense theory of time, agent causation, particular views about the analysis of causation, which means that you can have that causation is not just like between events, it can be between other things as well, which allows you to have a cause of the universe. All of these were just sort of swept under the rug, not really addressed. But whenever there was anything that Scott brought up that was even like slightly controversial or objectionable, Craig pounced on it. I think for the most part, he pounced on pretty much everything of that sort and objected to it, sometimes even interrupting, which I thought was quite rude. Interrupting if someone's mischaracterizing you is one thing, but if they're just like making their argument and they've been polite to you, I think you should just let them finish. So yeah, I really didn't like that aspect of it. And I thought that it's particularly baffling that Craig doesn't seem to understand this objection that, look, if causes are things that happen inside of space and time, then space and time itself may well just not have a cause because it's not in the set of things that have causes. Like it just can't. And therefore there's no problem with things popping into being, because things popping into being inside of the space of causal space and time is a thing that doesn't happen, because things that begin need to have the necessary and sufficient causes plausibly in that area. But the becoming into being of the causal order itself, well, that may well not have a cause. And in fact, it may be that that's the only thing that doesn't have a cause, right? Because everything else exists within the causal order. So that seems at least a very cogent view. And I'd be interested to hear what Craig actually has to say in response to that, instead of just repeating this strange idea that you need an explanation for why things don't come into being. Like there's nothing constraining it from coming into being, as if we need an explanation for what prevents things from coming into being, which just seems to me a very strange inversion of metaphysics. Anyway, so that was quite frustrating, although it's not really surprising. I sort of expected Craig to use these sorts of tactics of dodging the question, appealing to authority, mocking in subtle ways at a few points, shifting the burden of proof, using inconsistent epistemic standards of his interlocutor than he himself provides, as well as sweeping under the rug problematic aspects of his philosophy that he doesn't want to address, like how ancient causation works, and like whether events can have causes, and like the extent of the present, things like this that I think are actually very important, but he doesn't like to talk about. So hopefully people found this analysis interesting. I know it was a bit long, but I mean, given that it's an hour video, less than 2.5 hours of analysis, I think is pretty good. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you next time. See ya.